Thanks for visiting Timeless Audiobooks. Please remember to like, comment, share and subscribe for our latest audiobook uploads.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Celano. The King in Yellow. The Street of the First Shell. 1. Be of good cheer. The sullen month will die, and a young moon requite us by and by. Look how the old one, meagre, bent, and wan with age and fast, is fainting from the sky. The room was already dark. The high roofs opposite cut off what little remained of the December daylight. The girl drew her chair nearer the window, and choosing a large needle, threaded it, knotting the thread over her fingers. Then she smoothed the baby garment across her knees, and bending, bit off the thread and drew the smaller needle from where it rested in the hem. When she had brushed away the stray threads and bits of lace, she laid it again over her knees caressingly. Then she slipped the threaded needle from her corsage and passed it through a button. But as the button spun down the thread, her hand faltered, the thread snapped, and the button rolled across the floor. She raised her head. Her eyes were fixed on a strip of waning light above the chimneys. From somewhere in the city came sounds like the distant beating of drums. And beyond, far beyond, a vague muttering, now growing, swelling, rumbling in the distance like the pounding of surf upon the rocks. Now like the surf again, receding, growling, menacing. The cold had become intense, a bitter, piercing cold which strained and snapped at joist and beam, and turned the slush of yesterday to flint. From the street below every sound broke sharp and metallic. The clatter of sabots, the rattle of shutters, or the rare sound of a human voice. The air was heavy, weighted with the black cold as with a pall. To breathe was painful, to move an effort. In the desolate sky there was something that wearied. In the brooding clouds, something that saddened. It penetrated the freezing city cut by the freezing river, the splendid city with its towers and domes, its quays and bridges and its 1,000 spires. It entered the squares, it seized the avenues and the palaces, stole across bridges, and crept among the narrow streets of the Latin Quarter. Gray under the gray December sky, sadness, utter sadness. A fine icy sleet was falling, powdering the pavement with a tiny crystalline dust. It sifted against the window panes and drifted in heaps along the sill. The light at the window had nearly failed, and the girl bent low over her work. Presently she raised her head, brushing the curls from her eyes. "Jacques, dearest, don't forget to clean your palette." He said, "All right," and picking up the palette, sat down upon the floor in front of the stove. His head and shoulders were in the shadow, but the firelight fell across his knees and glimmered red on the blade of the palette knife. Full in the firelight beside him stood a color box. On the lid was carved, "J. Trent, École des Beaux-Arts, 1870. This inscription was ornamented with an American and a French flag. The sleet blew against the window panes, covering them with stars and diamonds, then, melting from the warmer air within, ran down and froze again in fern-like traceries. A dog whined, and the patter of small paws sounded on the zinc behind the stove. "Jacques, dear, do you think Hercules is hungry?" The patter of paws was redoubled behind the stove. "He's whining," she continued nervously, "and if it isn't because he's hungry, it is because—" Her voice faltered. A loud humming filled the air. The windows vibrated. "Oh, Jack!" she cried. "Another—" but her voice was drowned in the scream of a shell tearing through the clouds overhead. "What is the nearest yet?" she murmured. "Oh, no," he answered cheerfully. "It probably fell way over by Montmartre." And as she did not answer, he said again with exaggerated unconcern, "They wouldn't take the trouble to fire at the Latin Quarter. Anyway, they haven't a battery that can hurt it." After a while she spoke up brightly. "Jacques, dear, when are you going to take me to see Monsieur West's statues?" "I will bet," he said, throwing down his palette and walking over to the window beside her, "that Colette has been here today." "Why?" she asked, opening her eyes very wide. Then, "Oh, it's too bad, really. Men are tiresome when they think they know everything. And I warn you that if Monsieur West is vain enough to imagine that Colette—" From the north another shell came whistling and quavering through the sky, passing above them with a long-drawn screech which left the windows singing. That, he blurted out, was too close for comfort. They were silent for a while. Then he spoke again gaily. "Go on, Sylvia, and whither poor West." But she only sighed. "Oh, dear, I can never seem to get used to the shells." He sat down on the arm of the chair beside her. Her scissors fell jingling to the floor. She tossed the unfinished frock after them, and putting both arms about his neck, drew him down into her lap. "Don't go out tonight, Jacques." He kissed her uplifted face. "You know I must. Don't make it hard for me." "But when I hear the shells and know you are out in the city—" "But they all fall in Montmartre." "They may all fall in the Beaux-Arts. You said yourself that two struck the Quai d'Orsay." "Mere accident." "Jacques, have pity on me. Take me with you." "And who will there be to get dinner?" She rose and flung herself on the bed. "Oh, I can't get used to it. And I know you must go. But I beg you not to be late to dinner. If you knew what I suffer, I cannot help it. And you must be patient with me, dear." He said, "It is as safe there as it is in our own house." She watched him fill for her the alcohol lamp, and when he had lighted it and had taken his hat to go, she jumped up and clung to him in silence. After a moment he said, "Now, Sylvia, remember my courage is sustained by yours. Come, I must go." She did not move, and he repeated, "I must go." Then she stepped back, and he thought she was going to speak and waited. But she only looked at him, and, a little impatiently, he kissed her again, saying, "Don't worry, dearest." When he had reached the last flight of stairs on his way to the street, a woman hobbled out of the housekeeper's lodge, waving a letter and calling, "Monsieur Jacques! Monsieur Jacques! This was left by Monsieur Fallowby." He took the letter, and leaning on the threshold of the lodge, read it. "Dear Jack, I believe Braith is dead broke, and I'm sure Fallowby is. Braith swears he isn't, and Fallowby swears he is. So you can draw your own conclusions. I've got a scheme for a dinner, and if it works, I will let you fellows in. Yours faithfully, West. P.S. Fallowby has shaken Hartman and his gang, thank the Lord. There is something rotten there, or it may be he's only a miser. P.P.S. I'm more desperately in love than ever, but I'm sure she does not care a straw for me." "All right," said Trent with a smile to the concierge. "But tell me, how is Papa Cottard?" The old woman shook her head and pointed to the curtained bed in the lodge. "Père Cottard," he cried cheerily, "how goes the wound today?" He walked over to the bed and drew the curtains. An old man was lying among the tumbled sheets. "Better?" smiled Trent. "Better," repeated the man wearily, and after a pause, "Have you any news, Monsieur Jacques?" "I haven't been out today. I will bring you any rumor I may hear, though. Goodness knows I've got enough of rumors, he muttered to himself, then aloud, Cheer up. You're looking better. And the sortie? Oh, the sortie, that's for this week. General Trochu sent orders last night. It will be terrible. It will be sickening, thought Trent as he went out into the street and turned the corner toward the Rue de Seine. Slaughter, slaughter. Phew, I'm glad I'm not going. The street was almost deserted. A few women muffled in tattered military capes crept along the frozen pavement, and a wretchedly clad gamin hovered over the sewer hole at the corner of the boulevard. A rope around his waist held his rags together. From the rope hung a rat, still warm and bleeding. "There's another in there," he yelled at Trent. "I hit him, but he got away." Trent crossed the street and asked, "How much?" 2 francs for a quarter of a fat one. That's what they give at the Saint-Germain market. A violent fit of coughing interrupted him, but he wiped his face with the palm of his hand and looked cunningly at Trent. "Last week you could buy a rat for 6 francs. But," and here he swore violently, "the rats have quit the Rue de Seine, and they kill them now over by the new hospital. I'll let you have this for 7 francs. I can sell it for 10 in the Ile Saint-Louis." "You lie," said Trent, "and let me tell you that if you try to swindle anybody in this quarter, the people will make short work of you and your rats." He stood a moment eyeing the gamin, who pretended to snivel. Then he tossed him a franc, laughing. The child caught it, and thrusting it into his mouth, wheeled about to the sewer hole. For a second he crouched, motionless, alert, his eyes on the bars of the drain. Then, leaping forward, he hurled a stone into the gutter, and Trent left him to finish a fierce gray rat that writhed squealing at the mouth of the sewer. Suppose Braith should come to that, he thought. Poor little chap. And hurrying, he turned in the dirty Passage des Beaux-Arts and entered the 3rd house to the left. "Monsieur is at home," quavered the old concierge. Home, a garret absolutely bare, save for the iron bedstead in the corner and the iron basin and pitcher on the floor. West appeared at the door, winking with much mystery, and motioned Trent to enter. Braith, who was painting in bed to keep warm, looked up, laughed, and shook hands. "Any news?" The perfunctory question was answered as usual by, "Nothing but the cannon." Trent sat down on the bed. "Where on earth did you get that?" he demanded, pointing to a half-finished chicken nestling in a wash-basin. West grinned. "Are you millionaires, you two? Out with it." Braith, looking a little ashamed, began, "Oh, it's one of West's exploits," but was cut short by West, who said he would tell the story himself. "You see, before the siege, I had a letter of introduction to a type here, a fat banker, German-American variety, you know the species." "I see." "Well, of course I forgot to present the letter, but this morning, judging it to be a favorable opportunity, I called on him. The villain lives in comfort. Fires, my boy, fires in the anteroom. The Buttons finally condescends to carry my letter and card up, leaving me standing in the hallway, which I did not like. So I entered the first room. I saw and nearly fainted at the sight of a banquet on a table by the fire. Down comes Buttons, very insolent. No, oh no, his master is not at home, and in fact is too busy to receive letters of introduction just now. The siege, and many business difficulties. I deliver a kick to Buttons, pick up this chicken from the table, toss my card onto the empty plate, and addressing Buttons as a species of Prussian pig, march out with the honors of war." Trent shook his head. "I forgot to say that Hartman often dines there, and I draw my own conclusions," continued West. Now about this chicken. Half of it is for Braith and myself, and half for Colette. But of course you will help me eat my part because I'm not hungry. Neither am I, began Braith. But Trent, with a smile at the pinched faces before him, shook his head, saying, "What nonsense! You know I'm never hungry." West hesitated, reddened, and then, slicing off Braith's portion, but not eating any himself, said good night, and hurried away to number 470 Rue Serpente, where lived a pretty girl named Colette, orphan after Sedan, and heaven alone knew where she got the roses in her cheeks, for the siege came hard on the poor. "That chicken will delight her, but I really believe she's in love with West," said Trent. Then, walking over to the bed, "See here, old man. No dodging, you know. How much have you left?" The other hesitated and flushed. "Come, old chap," insisted Trent. Braith drew a purse from beneath his bolster and handed it to his friend with a simplicity that touched him. 7 sous, he counted. "You make me tired. Why on earth don't you come to me? I take it ill, Braith. How many times must I go over the same thing and explain to you that because I have money it is my duty to share it, and your duty and the duty of every American to share it with me? You can't get a cent. The city's blockaded, and the American minister has his hands full with all the German riffraff and deuce knows what. Why don't you act sensibly?" I will, Trent, but it's an obligation that perhaps I can never even in part repay. I'm poor, and of course you'll pay me. If I were a usurer, I would take your talent for security. When you are rich and famous... Don't, Trent. All right. Only no more monkey business. He slipped a dozen gold pieces into the purse, and tucking it again under the mattress, smiled at Braith. "How old are you?" he demanded. 16. Trent laid his hand lightly on his friend's shoulder. "I'm 22, and I have the rights of a grandfather as far as you are concerned. You'll do as I say until you're 21. "The siege will be over then, I hope," said Braith, trying to laugh. But the prayer in their hearts, "How long, O Lord, how long?" was answered by the swift scream of a shell soaring among the storm clouds of that December night. End of The Street of the First Shell, Part 1, from The King in Yellow, Part 2. The Street of the First Shell, recorded for LibriVox by Maria Celano. 2. West, standing in the doorway of a house in the Rue Serpentine, was speaking angrily. He said he didn't care whether Hartman liked it or not. He was telling him, not arguing with him. "You call yourself an American," he sneered. "Berlin and hell are full of that kind of American. You come loafing about Colette with your pockets stuffed with white bread and beef and a bottle of wine at 30 francs, and you can't really afford to give $1 to the American ambulance and public assistance, which Braith does, and he's half-starved." Hartman retreated to the curbstone, but West followed him, his face like a thundercloud. "Don't you dare to call yourself a countryman of mine," he growled. "No, nor an artist either. Artists don't worm themselves into the service of the public defense where they do nothing but feed like rats on the people's food. And I'll tell you now," he continued, dropping his voice, for Hartman had started as though stung, "you might better keep away from that Alsatian brasserie and the smug-faced thieves who haunt it. You know what they do with suspects." "You lie, you hound!" screamed Hartman, and flung the bottle in his hand straight at West's face. West had him by the throat in a second, and forcing him against the dead wool, shook him wickedly. "Now you listen to me," he muttered through his clenched teeth. "You are already a suspect, and I swear I believe you are a paid spy. It isn't my business to detect such vermin, and I don't intend to denounce you. But understand this. Colette don't like you, and I can't stand you. And if I catch you in this street again, I'll make it somewhat unpleasant. Get out, you sleek Prussian!" Hartman had managed to drag a knife from his pocket, but West tore it from him and hurled him into the gutter. A gamin who had seen this burst into a peal of laughter which rattled harshly in the silent street. Then everywhere windows were raised, and rows of haggard faces appeared, demanding to know why people should laugh in the starving city. "Is it a victory?" murmured one. "Look at that!" cried West as Hartman picked himself up from the pavement. "Look, you miser, look at those faces!" But Hartman gave him a look which he never forgot, and walked away without a word. Trent, who suddenly appeared at the corner, glanced curiously at West, who merely nodded toward his door, saying, "Come in, Fallowby's upstairs." "What are you doing with that knife?" demanded Fallowby as he and Trent entered the studio. West looked at his wounded hand, which still clutched the knife, but saying, "Cut myself by accident," tossed it into a corner and washed the blood from his fingers. Fallowby, fat and lazy, watched him without comment, but Trent, half divining how things had turned, walked over to Fallowby smiling. "I've a bone to pick with you," he said. "Where is it? I'm hungry," replied Fallowby with affected eagerness, but Trent, frowning, told him to listen. "How much did I advance you a week ago?" 380 francs, replied the other, with a squirm of contrition. "Where is it?" Fallowby began a series of intricate explanations which were soon cut short by Trent. "I know. You blew it in. You always blow it in. I don't care a rap what you did before the siege. I know you are rich, and have a right to dispose of your money as you wish to, and I also know that, generally speaking, it is none of my business. But now it is my business, as I have to supply the funds until you get some more, which you won't until this siege is ended one way or another. I wish to share what I have, but I won't see it thrown out of the window. Oh, yes, of course I know you will reimburse me, but that isn't the question. And, anyway, it's the opinion of your friends, old man, that you will not be worse off for a little abstinence from fleshly pleasures. You are positively a freak in this famine-cursed city of skeletons." "I am rather stout," he admitted. "Is it true you are out of money?" demanded Trent. "Yes, I am," sighed the other. "That roast-suckling pig on the Rue Saint-Honoré. Is it there yet?" continued Trent. "What?" stammered the feeble one. "Ah, I thought so. I caught you in ecstasy before that suckling pig at least a dozen times." Then, laughing, he presented Fallowby with a roll of 20-franc pieces, saying, "If these go for luxuries, you must live on your own flesh," and went over to aid West, who sat beside the wash-basin binding up his hand. West suffered him to tie the knot, and then said, "You remember, yesterday, when I left you in Braith to take the chicken to Colette?" "Chicken! Good heavens!" moaned Fallowby. "Chicken," repeated West, enjoying Fallowby's grief. I must explain that things are changed. Colette and I are to be married." What about the chicken?" moaned Fallowby. "Shut up," laughed Trent, and slipping his arm through West's, walked to the stairway. "The poor little thing," said West. "Just think, not a splinter of firewood for a week, and wouldn't tell me because she thought I needed it for my clay figure. Whew! When I heard it, I smashed that smirking clay nymph to pieces, and the rest can freeze and be hanged. After a moment he added timidly, "Won't you call on your way down and say bonsoir? It's number 17. "Yes," said Trent, and he went out softly, closing the door behind. He stopped on the third landing, lighted a match, scanned the numbers over the row of dingy doors, and knocked at number 17. "C'est toi, Georges?" The door opened. "Oh, pardon, Monsieur Jacques. I thought it was Monsieur West." Then, blushing furiously, "Oh, I see you have heard. Oh, thank you so much for your wishes. And I'm sure we love each other very much. And I'm dying to see Sylvia and tell her and—" "And what?" laughed Trent. "I am very happy," she sighed. "He's pure gold," returned Trent. And then gaily, "I want you and George to come and dine with us tonight. It's a little treat. You see, tomorrow is Sylvia's fête. She will be 19. I have written to Thorne, and the Guernelecks will come with their cousin Odile. Fallowby has engaged not to bring anybody but himself." The girl accepted shyly, charging him with loads of loving messages to Sylvia, and he said good night. He started up the street, walking swiftly, for it was bitter cold, and cutting across the Rue de la Lune he entered the Rue de Seine. The early winter night had fallen almost without warning, but the sky was clear and myriads of stars glittered in the heavens. The bombardment had become furious, a steady rolling thunder from the Prussian cannon, punctuated by the heavy shocks from Mount Valérien. The shells streamed across the sky, leaving trails like shooting stars, and now, as he turned to look back, rockets blue and red flared above the horizon from the fort of Issy, and the fortress of the north flamed like a bonfire. "Good news!" a man shouted over by the Boulevard Saint-Germain. As if by magic the streets were filled with people, shivering, chattering people with shrunken eyes. "Jacques!" cried one. "The Army of the Loire!" "Eh, mon vieux! It has come then at last. I told thee. Tomorrow, tonight, who knows?" "Is it true? Is it a sortie?" Someone said, "Oh God, a sortie!" "And my son?" another cried. "To the Seine? They say one can see the signals of the Army of the Loire from the Pont Neuf." There was a child standing near Trent who kept repeating, "Mama, Mama, then tomorrow we may eat white bread?" And beside him an old man swaying, stumbling, his shriveled hands crushed to his breast, muttering as if insane, "Could it be true? Who has heard the news? The shoemaker on the Rue de Bussy had it from a Mobile who had heard a franc-tireur repeat it to a captain of the National Guard." Trent followed the throng surging through the Rue de Seine to the river. Rocket after rocket clove the sky, and now, from Montmartre, the cannon clanged, and the batteries on Montparnasse joined in with a crash. The bridge was packed with people. Trent asked, "Who has seen the signals of the Army of the Loire?" "We are waiting for them," was the reply. He looked toward the north. Suddenly the huge silhouette of the Arc de Triomphe sprang into black relief against the flash of a cannon. The boom of the gun rolled along the quay, and the old bridge vibrated. Again, over by the Pont du Jour, a flash of heavy explosion shook the bridge, and then the whole eastern bastion of the fortifications blazed and crackled, sending a red flame into the sky. "Has anyone seen the signals yet?" he asked again. "We are waiting," was the reply. "Yes, waiting," murmured a man behind him. "Waiting. Sick, starved, freezing, but waiting. Is it a sortie? They go gladly. Is it to starve? They starve. They have no time to think of surrender. Are they heroes, these Parisians? Answer me, Trent." The American ambulance surgeon turned about and scanned the parapets of the bridge. "Any news, doctor?" asked Trent mechanically. "News?" said the doctor. "I don't know any. I haven't time to know any. What are these people after?" "They say that the army of the Loire has signaled Mont Valérien." "Poor devils." The doctor glanced about him for an instant, and then, "I'm so harried and worried that I don't know what to do. After the last sortie we had the work of 50 ambulances on our poor little corps. Tomorrow there's another sortie, and I wish you fellows could come over to headquarters. We may need volunteers. How is Madame?" he added abruptly. "Well," replied Trent, "but she seems to grow more nervous every day. I ought to be with her now." "Take care of her," said the doctor. Then, with a sharp look at the people, "I can't stop now. Good night." And he hurried away muttering, "Poor devils." Trent leaned over the parapet and blinked at the black river surging through the arches. Dark objects, carried swiftly on the breast of the current, struck with a grinding, tearing noise against the stone piers, spun around for an instant, and hurried away into the darkness, the ice from the Marne. As he stood staring into the water, a hand was laid on his shoulder. "Hello, Southwark!" he cried, turning around. "This is a queer place for you." "Trent, I have something to tell you. Don't stay here. Don't believe in the army of the Loire." And the attaché of the American legation slipped his arm through Trent's and drew him toward the Louvre. "Then it's another lie," said Trent bitterly. "Worse. We know at the legation. I can't speak of it, but that's not what I have to say. Something happened this afternoon. The Alsatian brasserie was visited, and an American named Hartmann was arrested. Do you know him?" "I know a German who calls himself an American. His name is Hartmann." "Well, he was arrested about 2 hours ago. They mean to shoot him." "What?" "Of course, we at the legation can't allow them to shoot him offhand, but the evidence seems conclusive." "Is he a spy?" "Well, the papers seized in his room are pretty damning proofs. And besides, he was caught, they say, swindling the Public Food Committee. He drew rations for 50. How, I don't know. He claims to be an American artist here, and we have been obliged to take notice of it at the legation. It's a nasty affair." "To cheat the people at such a time is worse than robbing the poor box," cried Trent angrily. "Let them shoot him." "He's an American citizen." "Yes, oh yes," said the other with bitterness in his voice. "American citizenship is a precious privilege when every goggle-eyed German—" His anger choked him. Southwark shook hands with him warmly. "It can't be helped. We must own the carrion. I am afraid you may be called upon to identify him as an American artist," he said with the ghost of a smile on his deep-lined face, and walked away through the Cours la Reine. Trent swore silently for a moment, then drew out his watch. 7 o'clock. Sylvia will be anxious, he thought, and hurried back to the river. The crowd still huddled, shivering on the bridge, a somber, pitiful congregation, peering out into the night for the signals of the army of the Loire, and their hearts beat time to the pounding of the guns. Their eyes lighted with each flash from the bastions, and hope rose with the drifting rockets. A black cloud hung over the fortifications. From horizon to horizon the cannon smoke stretched in wavering bands, now capping the spires and domes with cloud, now blowing in streamers and shreds along the streets, now descending from the housetops, enveloping quays, bridges, and river in a sulphurous mist. And through the smoke pall the lightning of the cannon played, and from time to time a rift above showed a fathomless black vault set with stars. He turned again into the Rue de Seine, that sad, abandoned street, with its rows of closed shutters and desolate ranks of unlighted lamps. He was a little nervous and wished once or twice for a revolver. But the slinking forms which passed him in the darkness were too weak with hunger to be dangerous, he thought, and he passed on unmolested to his doorway. But there someone sprang at his throat. Over and over the icy pavement he rolled with his assailant, tearing at the noose about his neck, and then with a wrench sprang to his feet. "Get up!" he cried to the other. Slowly and with great deliberation a small gamin picked himself out of the gutter and surveyed Trent with disgust. "That's a nice clean trick," said Trent. "A whelp of your age, you will finish against a dead wall. Give me that cord." The urchin handed him the noose without a word. Trent struck a match and looked at his assailant. It was the rat killer of the day before. I thought so," he muttered. "Tiens, c'est toi?" said the gamin tranquilly. The impudence, the overpowering audacity of the ragamuffin took Trent's breath away. "Do you know, you young strangler," he gasped, "that they shoot thieves of your age?" The child turned a passionless face to Trent. "Shoot, then." That was too much, and he turned on his heel and entered his hotel. Groping up the unlighted stairway, he at last reached his own landing and felt about in the darkness for the door. From his studio came the sound of voices, West's hearty laugh and Fallowby's chuckle. And at last he found the knob, and pushing back the door, stood a moment confused by the light. "Hello, Jack!" cried West. "You're a pleasant creature, inviting people to dine and letting them wait. Here's Fallowby weeping with hunger."
"Shut up," observed the latter. "Perhaps he's been out to buy a turkey."
"He's been out galloping. Look at his noose," laughed Guernalec. "So now we know where you get your cash," added West. "Vive la coup du Père François!" Trent shook hands with everybody and laughed at Sylvia's pale face. "I didn't mean to be late. I stopped on the bridge a moment to watch the bombardment. Were you anxious, Sylvia?" She smiled and murmured, "Oh, no," but her hand dropped into his and tightened convulsively.
"To the table!"
shouted Fallowby, and uttered a joyous whoop.
"Take it easy," observed Thorne, with a remnant of manners. "You are not the host, you know."
Marie Guernalec, who had been chattering with Colette, jumped up and took Thorne's arm, and Monsieur Guernalec drew Odile's arm through his. Trent, bowing gravely, offered his own arm to Colette. West took in Sylvia, and Fallowby hovered anxiously in the rear. "You march around the table 3 times singing the Marseillaise," explained Sylvia, "and Monsieur Fallowby pounds on the table and beats time." Fallowby suggested that they could sing after dinner, but his protest was drowned in the ringing chorus. Around the room they marched singing, with all their might, while Fallowby, with very bad grace, hammered on the table, consoling himself a little with the hope that the exercise would increase his appetite. Hercules, the black and tan, fled under the bed, from which retreat he yapped and whined until dragged out by Guernalec and placed in Odile's lap. "And now," said Trent gravely when everybody was seated, "listen," and he read the menu. Beef soup à la Siège de Paris. Fish, sardines à la Père Lachaise. White wine. Rôti red wine. Fresh beef à la sortie. Vegetables. Canned beans à la Chespeau. Canned peas gravelotte. Potatoes irlandaises. Miscellaneous. Cold corned beef à la Thiers. Stewed prunes à la Garibaldi. Dessert. Dried prunes, white bread, currant jelly, tea, café, liqueurs, pipes, and cigarettes. Fallowby applauded frantically, and Sylvia served the soup. "Isn't it delicious?" sighed Odile. Marie Guernalec sipped her soup in rapture. "Not at all like horse, and I don't care what they say. Horse doesn't taste like beef," whispered Colette to West. Fallowby, who had finished, began to caress his chin and eye the tureen. "Have some more, old chap?" inquired Trent. "Monsieur Fallowby cannot have any more," announced Sylvia. "I am saving these for the concierge." Fallowby transferred his eyes to the fish. The sardines, hot from the grill, were a great success. While the others were eating, Sylvia ran downstairs with the soup for the old concierge and her husband. And when she hurried back, flushed and breathless, and had slipped into her chair with a happy smile at Trent, that young man arose, and silence fell over the table. For an instant he looked at Sylvia and thought he had never seen her so beautiful. "You all know," he began, "that today is my wife's 19th birthday." Fallowby, bubbling with enthusiasm, waved his glass in circles about his head to the terror of Odile and Colette, his neighbors. And Thorne, West, and Guernalec refilled their glasses 3 times before the storm of applause which the toast of Sylvia had provoked subsided. 3 times the glasses were filled and emptied to Sylvia, and again to Trent, who protested. "This is irregular," he cried. "The next toast is to the 2 republics, France and America." To the republics! To the republics! They cried, and the toast was drunk amid shouts of
"Vive la France!"
"Vive l'Amérique!" "Vive la nation!" Then Trent, with a smile at West, offered the toast
"To a happy pair."
and everybody understood, and Sylvia leaned over and kissed Colette, while Trent bowed to West. The beef was eaten in comparative calm, but when it was finished and a portion of it set aside for the old people below, Trent cried,
"Drink to Paris! May she rise from her ruins and crush the invader!"
And the cheers rang out, drowning for a moment the monotonous thunder of the Prussian guns. Pipes and cigarettes were lighted, and Trent listened for an instant to the animated chatter around him, broken by ripples of laughter from the girls or the mellow chuckle of Fallowby. Then he turned to West.
"There is going to be a sortie tonight," he said. "I saw the American ambulance surgeon just before I came in, and he asked me to speak to you fellows. Any aid we can give him will not come amiss."
Then, dropping his voice and speaking in English, "As for me, I shall go out with the ambulance tomorrow morning. There is, of course, no danger, but it's just as well to keep it from Sylvia." West nodded. Thorne and Guernalec, who had heard, broke in and offered assistance, and Fallowby volunteered with a groan.
"All right," said Trent rapidly. "No more now, but meet me tomorrow morning at ambulance headquarters at 8.
Sylvia and Colette, who were becoming uneasy with the conversation in English now, demanded to know what they were talking about. "What does a sculptor usually talk about?" cried West with a laugh. Odile glanced reproachfully at Thorne, her fiancé. "You are not French, you know. It is none of your business, this war," said Odile with much dignity. Thorne looked meek, but West assumed an air of outraged virtue. "It seems," he said to Fallowby, "that a fellow cannot discuss the beauties of Greek sculpture in his mother tongue without being openly suspected." Colette placed her hand over his mouth and, turning to Sylvia, murmured, "They are horribly untruthful, these men."
"I believe the word for ambulance is the same in both languages," said Marie Guernalec saucily. "Sylvia, don't toast Monsieur Trent."
"Jacques," whispered Sylvia, "promise me." A knock at the studio door interrupted her.
"Come in,"
cried Fallowby, but Trent sprang up and, opening the door, looked out. Then, with a hasty excuse to the rest, he stepped into the hallway and closed the door. When he returned, he was grumbling. "What is it, Jack?" cried West.
"What is it?" repeated Trent savagely. "I'll tell you what it is.
I have received a dispatch from the American minister to go at once and identify and claim as a fellow countryman and a brother artist, a rascally thief and a German spy.
Don't go,
suggested Fallowby.
If I don't, they'll shoot him at once.
Let them, growled Thorne.
Do you fellows know who it is?
Hartman, shouted West, inspired. Sylvia sprang up, deathly white, but Adele slipped her arm around her and supported her to a chair, saying calmly, Sylvia has fainted. It's the hot room. Bring some water. Trent brought it at once. Sylvia opened her eyes, and after a moment rose, and supported by Marie Guernalec and Trent, passed into the bedroom. It was the signal for breaking up, and everybody came and shook hands with Trent, saying they hoped Sylvia would sleep it off and that it would be nothing. When Marie Guernalec took leave of him, she avoided his eyes, but he spoke to her cordially and thanked her for her aid. "Anything I can do, Jack?" inquired West, lingering, and then hurried downstairs to catch up with the rest. Trent leaned over the banister, listening to their footsteps and chatter, and then the lower door banged and the house was silent. He lingered, staring down into the blackness, biting his lips. Then, with an impatient movement, "I am crazy," he muttered, and lighting a candle, he went into the bedroom. Sylvia was lying on the bed. He bent over her, smoothing the curly hair on her forehead.
"Are you better, dear Sylvia?"
She did not answer, but raised her eyes to his. For an instant he met her gaze, but what he read there sent a chill to his heart, and he sat down, covering his face with his hands. At last she spoke in a voice, changed and strained, a voice which he had never heard, and he dropped his hands and listened, bolt upright in the chair.
"Jacques, it has come at last. I have felt it and trembled. Ah, how often have I lain awake at night with this on my heart and prayed that I might die before you should ever know of it. For I love you, Jack, and if you go away I cannot live. I have deceived you. It happened before I knew you, but since that first day when you found me weeping in the Luxembourg and spoke to me, Jack, I have been faithful to you in every thought and deed. I loved you from the first, and did not dare to tell you this, fearing that you would go away. And since then my love has grown, and oh, I suffered. But I dared not tell you, and now you know, but you do not know the worst. For him now, what do I care? He was cruel, oh so cruel." She hid her face in her arms. "Must I go on? Must I tell you? Can you not imagine? Oh, Jacques." He did not stir. His eyes seemed dead. I was so young. I knew nothing. And he said that he loved me." Trent rose and struck the candle with his clenched fist, and the room was dark. The bells of St. Sulpice told the hour, and she started up, speaking with feverish haste. "I must finish. When you told me you loved me, you asked me nothing. But then, even then, it was too late, and that other life which binds me to him must stand forever between you and me. For there is another whom he has claimed, and is good to. He must not die. They cannot shoot him for that other's sake." Trent sat motionless, but his thoughts ran on in an interminable whirl. Sylvia, little Sylvia, who shared with him his student life, who bore with him the dreary desolation of the siege without complaint, this slender, blue-eyed girl whom he was so quietly fond of, whom he teased or caressed as the whim suited, who sometimes made him the least bit impatient with her passionate devotion to him. Could this be the same Sylvia who lay weeping there in the darkness? Then he clenched his teeth. Let him die! Let him die! But then, for Sylvia's sake, and for that other's sake, yes, he would go. He must go. His duty was plain before him. But Sylvia! He could not be what he had been to her. And yet a vague terror seized him. Now all was said. Trembling, he struck a light. She lay there, her curly hair tumbled about her face, her small white hands pressed to her breast. He could not leave her, and he could not stay.
He never knew before that he loved her. She had been a mere comrade, this girl-wife of his. Ah, he loved her now with all his heart and soul, and he knew it, only when it was too late. Too late? Why? Then he thought of that other one, binding her, linking her forever to the creature who stood in danger of his life. With an oath he sprang to the door, but the door would not open, or was it that he pressed it back, locked it, and flung himself on his knees beside the bed, knowing that he dared not for his life's sake leave what was his all in life. End of The Street of the First Shell, Part 2, from The King in Yellow, Part 2. The Street of the First Shell, recorded for LibriVox by Maria Celano. 3. It was 4 in the morning when he came out of the prison of the condemned with the secretary of the American legation. A knot of people had gathered around the American minister's carriage, which stood in front of the prison, the horses stamping and pawing in the icy street, the coachman huddled on the box, wrapped in furs. Southwark helped the secretary into the carriage and shook hands with Trent, thanking him for coming. "How the scoundrel did stare," he said. "Your evidence was worse than a kick, but it saved his skin for the moment at least, and prevented complications." The secretary sighed.
"We have done our part. Now let them prove him a spy and we wash our hands of him. Jump in, Captain. Come along, Trent."
"I have a word to say to Captain Southwark. I won't detain him," said Trent hastily. And dropping his voice, "Southwark, help me now. You know the story from the blackguard. You know the child is at his rooms. Get it and take it to my own apartment, and if he is shot, I will provide a home for it." "I understand," said the captain gravely. "Will you do this at once?" "At once," he replied. Their hands met in a warm clasp, and then Captain Southwark climbed into the carriage, motioning Trent to follow, but he shook his head, saying "Good-bye," and the carriage rolled away. He watched the carriage to the end of the street, then started toward his own quarter, but after a step or two hesitated, stopped, and finally turned away in the opposite direction. Something, perhaps it was the sight of the prisoner he had so recently confronted, nauseated him. He felt the need of solitude and quiet to collect his thoughts. The events of the evening had shaken him terribly, but he would walk it off, forget, bury everything, and then go back to Sylvia. He started on swiftly, and for a time the bitter thoughts seemed to fade, but when he paused at last, breathless under the Arc de Triomphe, the bitterness and the wretchedness of the whole thing, yes, of his whole misspent life, came back with a bang. Then the face of the prisoner, stamped with a horrible grimace of fear, grew in the shadows before his eyes. Sick at heart, he wandered up and down under the great arc, striving to occupy his mind, peering up at the sculptured cornices to read the names of the heroes in battles which he knew were engraved there, but all was the ashen face of Hartmann followed him, grinning with terror. Or was it terror? Was it not triumph? At the thought he leaped like a man who feels a knife at his throat, but after a savage tramp around the square, came back again and sat down to battle with his misery. The air was cold, but his cheeks were burning with angry shame. Shame? Why? Was it because he had married a girl whom chance had made a mother? Did he love her? Was this miserable bohemian existence, then, his end and aim in life? He turned his eyes upon the secrets of his heart and read an evil story, the story of the past, and he covered his face for shame, while keeping time to the dull pain throbbing in his head. His heart beat out the story for the future, shame and disgrace. Roused at last from a lethargy which had begun to numb the bitterness of his thoughts, he raised his head and looked about. A sudden fog had settled in the streets. The arches of the Arc were choked with it. He would go home. A great horror of being alone seized him, but he was not alone. The fog was peopled with phantoms. All around him in the mist they moved, drifting through the arches in lengthening lines, and vanished, while from the fog others rose up, swept past and were engulfed. He was not alone, for even at his side they crowded, touched him, swarmed before him, beside him, behind him, pressed him back, seized and bore him with them through the mist. Down a dim avenue, through lanes and alleys white with fog, they moved, and if they spoke, their voices were dull as the vapor which shrouded them. At last in front a bank of masonry and earth cut by a massive iron-barred gate towered up in the fog. Slowly and more slowly they glided, shoulder to shoulder and thigh to thigh. Then all movement ceased. A sudden breeze stirred the fog. It wavered and eddied. Objects became more distinct. A pallor crept above the horizon, touching the edges of the watery clouds, and drew dull sparks from 1,000 bayonets. Bayonets! They were everywhere, cleaving the fog or flowing beneath it in rivers of steel. High on the wall of masonry and earth a great gun loomed, and around it figures moved in silhouettes. Below, a broad torrent of bayonets swept through the iron-barred gateway, out into the shadowy plain. It became lighter. Faces became more distinct among the marching masses, and he recognized one.
"You, Philippe!"
The figure turned its head.
Trent cried, "Is there room for me?"
But the other only waved his arm in a vague adieu and was gone with the rest. Presently the cavalry began to pass, squadron on squadron, crowding out into the darkness, then many cannon, then an ambulance, then again the endless lines of bayonets. Beside him a cuirassier sat on his steaming horse, and in front, among a group of mounted officers, he saw a general, with the astrakhan collar of his dolman turned up about his bloodless face. Some women were weeping near him, and one was struggling to force a loaf of black bread into a soldier's haversack. The soldier tried to aid her, but the sack was fastened, and his rifle bothered him, so Trent held it while the woman unbuttoned the sack and forced in the bread, now all wet with her tears. The rifle was not heavy. Trent found it wonderfully manageable. Was the bayonet sharp? He tried it. Then a sudden longing, a fierce, imperative desire took possession of him. "Chouette!" cried a gamin clinging to the barred gate. "Encore toi, mon vieux?" Trent looked up, and the rat-killer laughed in his face. But when the soldier had taken the rifle again, and thanking him, ran hard to catch his battalion, he plunged into the throng about the gateway. "Are you going?" he cried to a marine who sat in the gutter bandaging his foot. "Yes." Then a girl, a mere child, caught him by the hand and led him into the cafe which faced the gate. The room was crowded with soldiers, some, white and silent, sitting on the floor, others groaning on the leather-covered settees. The air was sour and suffocating. "Choose," said the girl with a little gesture of pity. "They can't go." In a heap of clothing on the floor he found a capote and kepi. She helped him buckle his knapsack, cartridge box, and belt, and showed him how to load the chassepot rifle, holding it on her knees. When he thanked her, she started to her feet. "You are a foreigner." "American," he said, moving toward the door. But the child barred his way. "I am a Breton. My father is up there with the cannon of the marine. He will shoot you if you are a spy." They faced each other for a moment, then sighing, he bent over and kissed the child. "Pray for France, little one," he murmured. And she repeated with a pale smile,
"For France, and you, bon monsieur."
He ran across the street and through the gateway. Once outside, he edged into line and shouldered his way along the road. A corporal passed, looked at him, repassed, and finally called an officer. "You belong to the 68th," growled the corporal, looking at the number on his kepi.
"We have no use for Frontiers,"
added the officer, catching sight of his black trousers. "I wish to volunteer in place of a comrade," said Trent, and the officer shrugged his shoulders and passed on. Nobody paid much attention to him, one or two merely glancing at his trousers. The road was deep with slush and mud, plowed and torn by wheels and hoofs. A soldier in front of him wrenched his foot in an icy rut, and it dragged himself to the edge of the embankment, groaning. The plain on either side of them was gray with melting snow. Here and there behind dismantled hedgerows stood wagons bearing white flags with red crosses. Sometimes the driver was a priest in rusty hat and gown, sometimes a crippled mobile. Once they passed a wagon driven by a sister of charity. Silent, empty houses with great rents in their walls, and every window blank, huddled along the road. Further on, within the zone of danger, nothing of human habitation remained except here and there a pile of frozen bricks or a blackened cellar choked with snow. For some time Trent had been annoyed by the man behind him who kept treading on his heels. Convinced at last that it was intentional, he turned to remonstrate and found himself face to face with a fellow student from the Beaux Arts. Trent stared.
"I thought you were in the hospital."
The other shook his head, pointing to his bandaged jaw.
"I see you can't speak. Can I do anything?"
The wounded man rummaged in his haversack and produced a crust of black bread.
"He can't eat it. His jaw is smashed, and he wants you to chew it for him,"
said the soldier next to him. Trent took the crust, and grinding it in his teeth morsel by morsel, passed it back to the starving man. From time to time mounted orderlies sped to the front, covering them with slush. It was a chilly, silent march through sodden meadows wreathed in fog. Along the railroad embankment across the ditch, another column moved parallel to their own. Trent watched it, a somber mass, now distinct, now vague, now blotted out in a puff of fog. Once for half an hour he lost it, but when again it came into view, he noticed a thin line detach itself from the flank and, bellying in the middle, swing rapidly to the west. At the same moment a prolonged crackling broke out in the fog in front. Other lines began to slough off from the column, swinging east and west, and the crackling became continuous. A battery passed at full gallop, and he drew back with his comrades to give it way. It went into action a little to the right of his battalion, and as the shot from the first rifled piece boomed through the mist, the cannon from the fortifications opened with a mighty roar. An officer galloped by shouting something which Trent did not catch, but he saw the ranks in front suddenly part company with his own and disappear in the twilight. More officers rode up and stood beside him, peering into the fog. Away in front the crackling had become a prolonged crash. It was dreary waiting. Trent chewed some bread for the man behind, who tried to swallow it, and after a while shook his head, motioning Trent to eat the rest himself. A corporal offered him a little brandy, and he drank it, but when he turned around to return the flask, the corporal was lying on the ground. Alarmed, he looked at the soldier next to him, who shrugged his shoulders and opened his mouth to speak, but something struck him, and he rolled over and over into the ditch below. At that moment the horse of one of the officers gave a bound and backed into the battalion, lashing out with his heels. One man was ridden down, another was kicked in the chest and hurled through the ranks. The officer sank his spurs into the horse and forced him to the front again, where he stood trembling. The cannonade seemed to draw nearer. A staff officer, riding slowly up and down the battalion, suddenly collapsed in his saddle and clung to his horse's mane. One of his boots dangled, crimsoned and dripping, from the stirrup. Then out of the mist in front men came running. The roads, the fields, the ditches were full of them, and many of them fell. For an instant he imagined he saw horsemen riding about like ghosts in the vapors beyond, and a man behind him cursed horribly, declaring he too had seen them, and that they were Uhlans. But the battalion stood inactive, and the mist fell again over the meadows. The colonel sat heavily upon his horse, his bullet-shaped head buried in the astrakhan collar of his dolman, his fat legs sticking straight out in the stirrups. The buglers clustered about him with bugles poised, and behind him a staff officer in a pale blue jacket smoked a cigarette and chatted with a captain of hussars. From the road in front came the sound of furious galloping, and an orderly reined up beside the colonel, who motioned him to the rear without turning his head. Then on the left a confused murmur arose, which ended in a shout. A hussar passed like the wind, followed by another and another, and then squadron after squadron whirled by them into the sheeted mists. At that instant the colonel reared in his saddle. The bugles clanged, and the whole battalion scrambled down the embankment, over the ditch, and started across the soggy meadow. Almost at once Trent lost his cap. Something snatched it from his head. He thought it was a tree branch. A good many of his comrades rolled over in the slush and ice, and he imagined that they had slipped. One pitched right across his path, and he stopped to help him up. But the man screamed when he touched him, and an officer shouted, "Forward! Forward!" So he ran on again. It was a long jog through the mist, and he was often obliged to shift his rifle. When at last they lay panting behind the railroad embankment, he looked about him. He had felt the need of action, of a desperate physical struggle, of killing and crushing. He had been seized with a desire to fling himself among masses and tear right and left. He longed to fire, to use the thin, sharp bayonet of his chassepot. He had not expected this. He wished to become exhausted, to struggle and cut until incapable of lifting his arm. Then he had intended to go home. He heard a man say that half the battalion had gone down in the charge, and he saw another examining a corpse under the embankment. The body, still warm, was clothed in a strange uniform, but even when he noticed the spiked helmet lying a few inches further away, he did not realize what had happened. The colonel sat on his horse a few feet to the left, his eyes sparkling under the crimson kepi. Trent heard him reply to an officer, "I can hold it, but another charge and I won't have enough men left to sound a bugle." "Were the Prussians here?" Trent asked of a soldier who sat wiping the blood trickling from his hair.
"Yes, the hussars cleaned them out. We caught their crossfire." "We are supporting a battery on the embankment,"
said another. Then the battalion crawled over the embankment and moved along the lines of twisted rails. Trent rolled up his trousers and tucked them into his woolen socks, but they halted again, and some of the men sat down on the dismantled railroad track. Trent looked for his wounded comrade from the Boarts. He was standing in his place, very pale. The cannonade had become terrific. For a moment the mist lifted. He caught a glimpse of the 1st Battalion motionless on the railroad track in front, of regiments on either flank, and then, as the fog settled again, the drums beat and the music of the bugles began away on the extreme left. A restless movement passed among the troops. The colonel threw up his arm. The drums rolled, and the battalion moved off through the fog. They were near the front now, for the battalion was firing as it advanced. Ambulances galloped along the base of the embankment to the rear, and the hussars passed and repassed like phantoms. They were in the front at last, for all about them was movement and turmoil, while from the fog, close at hand, came cries and groans and crashing volleys. Shells fell everywhere, bursting along the embankment, splashing them with frozen slush. Trent was frightened. He began to dread the unknown which lay there, crackling and flaming in obscurity. The shock of the cannon sickened him. He could even see the fog light up with a dull orange as the thunder shook the earth. It was near, he felt certain, for the colonel shouted, "Forward!" And the 1st Battalion was hastening into it. He felt its breath. He trembled, but hurried on. A fearful discharge in front terrified him. Somewhere in the fog men were cheering, and the colonel's horse, streaming with blood, plunged about in the smoke. Another blast and shock right in his face. almost stunned him, and he faltered. All the men to the right were down. His head swam. The fog and smoke stupefied him. He put out his hand for support and caught something. It was the wheel of a gun carriage, and a man sprang from behind it, aiming a blow at his head with the rammer, but stumbled back shrieking with a bayonet through his neck, and Trent knew that he had killed. Mechanically he stooped to pick up his rifle, but the bayonet was still in the man, who lay beating with red hands against the sod. It sickened him, and he leaned on the cannon. Men were firing all around him now, and the air was foul with smoke and sweat. Somebody seized him from behind and another in front, but others in turn seized them and struck them solid blows. The click, click, click of the bayonets infuriated him, and he grasped the rammer and struck out blindly until it was shivered to pieces. A man threw his arm around his neck and bore him to the ground, but he throttled him and raised himself on his knees. He saw a comrade seize the cannon and fall across it with his skull crushed in. He saw the colonel tumble clean out of his saddle into the mud. Then consciousness fled. When he came to himself, he was lying on the embankment among the twisted rails. On every side huddled men who cried out and cursed and fled away into the fog, and he staggered to his feet and followed them. Once he stopped to help a comrade with a bandaged jaw, who could not speak but clung to his arm for a time and then fell dead in the freezing mire. And again he aided another, who groaned, "Trent, c'est moi, Philippe," until a sudden volley in the midst relieved him of his charge. An icy wind swept down from the heights, cutting the fog into shreds. For an instant, with an evil leer, the sun peered through the naked woods of Vincennes, sank like a blood clot in the battery smoke, lower, lower, into the blood-soaked plain. End of Part 3 of The Street of the First Shell from The King in Yellow. The Street of the First Shell, Part 4, recorded for LibriVox by Maria Celano. When midnight sounded from the belfry of St. Sulpice, the gates of Paris were still choked with fragments of what had once been an army. They entered with the night, a sullen horde, spattered with slime, faint with hunger and exhaustion. There was little disorder at first, and the throng at the gates parted silently as the troops tramped along the freezing streets. Confusion came as the hours passed, swiftly and more swiftly, crowding squadron after squadron and battery on battery, horses plunging and caissons jolting. The remnants from the front surged through the gates, a chaos of cavalry and artillery struggling for the right of way. Close upon them stumbled the infantry, here a skeleton of a regiment marching with a desperate attempt at order, there a riotous mob of mobiles crushing their way to the streets, then a turmoil of horsemen, cannon, troops without officers, officers without men, then again a line of ambulances, the wheels groaning under their heavy loads. Dumb with misery, the crowd looked on. All through the day the ambulances had been arriving, and all day long the ragged throng whimpered and shivered by the barriers. At noon the crowd was increased tenfold, filling the squares about the gates and swarming over the inner fortifications. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon the German batteries suddenly wreathed themselves in smoke, and the shells fell fast on Montparnasse. At 20 minutes after 4, 2 projectiles struck a house in the Rue de Bac, and a moment later the first shell fell in the Latin Quarter. Braith was painting in bed when West came in, very much scared. "I wish you would come down. Our house has been knocked into a cocked hat, and I'm afraid that some of the pillagers may take it into their heads to pay us a visit tonight." Braith jumped out of bed and bundled himself into a garment which had once been an overcoat. "Anybody hurt?" he inquired, struggling with a sleeve full of dilapidated lining. "No, Colette is barricaded in the cellar, and the concierge ran away to the fortifications. There will be a rough gang there if the bombardment keeps up. You might help us." "Of course," said Braith. But it was not until they had reached the Rue Serpente and had turned into the passage which led to West's cellar that the latter cried, "Have you seen Jack Trent today?" "No," replied Braith, looking troubled. "He was not at ambulance headquarters." "He stayed to take care of Sylvia, I suppose." A bomb came crashing through the roof of a house at the end of the alley and burst in the basement, showering the street with slate and plaster. A second struck a chimney and plunged into the garden, followed by an avalanche of bricks. And another exploded with a deafening report in the next street. They hurried along the passage to the steps which led to the cellar. Here again Braith stopped. "Don't you think I had better run up to see if Jack and Sylvia are well entrenched? I can get back before dark." "No, go in and find Colette, and I'll go." No, let me go. There's no danger." "I know it," replied West calmly, and, dragging Braith into the alley, pointed to the cellar steps. The iron door was barred. "Colette! Colette!" he called. The door swung inward, and the girl sprang up the stairs to meet them. At that instant Braith, glancing behind him, gave a startled cry, and pushing the two before him into the cellar, jumped down after them and slammed the iron door. A few seconds later a heavy jar from the outside shook the hinges. "They're here," muttered West, very pale.
"That door,"
observed Colette calmly,
"will hold forever."
Braith examined the low iron structure, now trembling with the blows rained on it from without. West glanced anxiously at Colette, who displayed no agitation, and this comforted him. "I don't believe they will spend much time here," said Braith. "They only rummage in cellars for spirits, I imagine. Unless they hear that valuables are buried there." "But surely nothing is buried here!" exclaimed Braith uneasily. "Unfortunately there is," growled West. "That miserly landlord of mine." A crash from the outside, followed by a yell, cut him short. Then blow after blow shook the doors, until there came a sharp snap, a clinking of metal, and a triangular bit of iron fell inwards, leaving a hole through which struggled a ray of light. Instantly West knelt, and shoving his revolver through the aperture, fired every cartridge. For a moment the alley resounded with the racket of the revolver. Then absolute silence followed. Presently a single questioning blow fell upon the door, and a moment later another and another, and then a sudden crack zigzagged across the iron plate. "Here," said West, seizing Colette by the wrist. "You follow me, Braith." And he ran swiftly toward a circular spot of light at the further end of the cellar. The spot of light came from a barred manhole above. West motioned for Braith to mount on his shoulders. "Push it over! You must!" With little effort Braith lifted the barred cover, scrambled out on his stomach, and easily raised Colette from West's shoulders. "Quick, old chap!" cried the latter. Braith twisted his legs around a fence chain and leaned down again. The cellar was flooded with a yellow light, and the air reeked with the stench of petroleum torches. The iron door still held, but a whole plate of metal was gone, and now as they looked a figure came creeping through, holding a torch. "Quick!" whispered Braith. "Jump!" And West hung dangling until Colette grasped him by the collar and he was dragged out. Then her nerves gave way and she wept hysterically, but West threw his arm around her and led her across the garden into the next street, where Braith, after replacing the manhole cover and piling some stone slabs from the wall over it, rejoined them. It was almost dark. They hurried through the street, now only lighted by burning buildings or the swift glare of the shells. They gave wide berth to the fires, but at a distance saw the flitting forms of pillagers among the debris. Sometimes they passed a female fury crazed with drink shrieking anathemas upon the world, or some slouching lout whose blackened face and hands betrayed his share in the work of destruction. At last they reached the Seine and passed the bridge, and then Braith said, "I must go back. I am not sure of Jack and Sylvia." As he spoke, he made way for a crowd which came trampling across the bridge and along the river wall by the d'Orsay barracks. In the midst of it West caught the measured tread of a platoon. A lantern passed, a file of bayonets, then another lantern which glimmered on a deathly face behind, and Colette gasped, "Hartmann!" and he was gone. They peered fearfully across the embankment, holding their breath. There was a shuffle of feet on the quay, and the gate of the barracks slammed. A lantern shone for a moment at the postern. The crowd pressed to the grill. Then came the clang of the volley from the stone parade. One by one the petroleum torches flared along the embankment, and now the whole square was in motion. Down from the Champs-Élysées and across the Place de la Concorde straggled the fragments of the battle. A company here and a mob there. They poured in from every street, followed by women and children, and a great murmur, borne on the icy wind, swept through the Arc de Triomphe and down the dark avenue. "Perdue! Perdue!" A ragged end of a battalion was pressing past, the spectre of annihilation. West groaned. Then a figure sprang from the shadowy ranks and called West's name. And when he saw it was Trent, he cried out. Trent seized him, white with terror. "Sylvia?" West stared, speechless, but Colette moaned,
"Oh, Sylvia, Sylvia, and they are shelling the quarter."
"Trent!" shouted Braith, but he was gone, and they could not overtake him. The bombardment ceased as Trent crossed the Boulevard Saint-Germain, but the entrance to the Rue de Seine was blocked by a heap of smoking bricks. Everywhere the shells had torn great holes in the pavement. The café was a wreck of splinters and glass. The bookstore tottered, ripped from roof to basement, and the little bakery, long since closed, bulged outward above a mass of slate and tin. He climbed over the steaming bricks and hurried into the Rue de Tournon. On the corner a fire blazed, lighting up his own street, and on the bank wall, beneath a shattered gas lamp, a child was writing with a bit of cinder. Here fell the first shell. The letters stared him in the face. The rat-killer finished and stepped back to view his work, but catching sight of Trent's bayonet, screamed and fled, and as Trent staggered across the shattered street, from holes and crannies in the ruins fierce women fled from their work of pillage, cursing him. At first he could not find his house, for the tears blinded him, but he felt along the wall and reached the door. A lantern burned in the concierge's lodge, and the old man lay dead beside it. Faint with fright, he leaned a moment on his rifle. Then, snatching the lantern, sprang up the stairs. He tried to call, but his tongue hardly moved. On the second floor he saw plaster on the stairway, and on the third the floor was torn and the concierge lay in a pool of blood across the landing. The next floor was his, theirs. The door hung from its hinges. The walls gaped. He crept in and sank down by the bed, and there 2 arms were flung around his neck, and a tear-stained face sought his own. "Sylvia!"
"Oh, Jacques, Jacques, Jacques!"
From the tumbled pillow beside them a child wailed.
"They brought it. It is mine," she sobbed.
"Ours," he whispered, with his arms around them both. Then from the stairs below came Braith's anxious voice.
"Trent, is all well?"
End of the Street of the First Shell.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush, Marquette, Michigan, September 2006. The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. The Street of Our Lady of the Fields. Parts 1 and 2. Part 1.
Et tous les jours passés dans la tristesse nous sont comptés comme des jours heureux. The street is not fashionable, neither is it shabby. It is a pariah among streets, a street without a quarter. It is generally understood to lie outside the pale of the aristocratic Avenue de l'Observatoire. The students of the Montparnasse quarter consider it swell, and will have none of it. The Latin quarter from the Luxembourg, its northern frontier, sneers at its respectability and regards with disfavor the correctly costumed students who haunt it. Few strangers go into it. At times, however, the Latin quarter students use it as a thoroughfare between the Rue de Rennes and the Bullier, but except for that and the weekly afternoon visits of parents and guardians to the convent near the Rue Vavin, the street of Our Lady of the Fields is as quiet as a passé boulevard. Perhaps the most respectable portion lies between the Rue de la Grande Chaumière and the Rue Vavin. At least, this was the conclusion arrived at by the Reverend Joel Byram, as he rambled through it with Hastings in charge. To Hastings the street looked pleasant in the bright June weather, and he had begun to hope for its selection when the Reverend Byram shied violently at the cross on the convent opposite. "Jesuits," he muttered. "Well," said Hastings warily, "I imagine we won't find anything better. You say yourself that vice is triumphant in Paris, and it seems to me that in every street we find Jesuits, or something worse." After a moment he repeated, "Or something worse, which of course I would not notice except for your kindness in warning me." Dr. Byram sucked in his lips and looked about him. He was impressed by the evident respectability of the surroundings. Then, frowning at the convent, he took Hastings' arm and shuffled across the street to an iron gateway which bore the number 201 bis, painted in white on a blue ground. Below this was a notice printed in English. 1. For porter, please oppress once. 2. For servant, please oppress twice. 3. For parlor, please oppress thrice. Hastings touched the electric button 3 times, and they were ushered through the garden and into the parlor by a trim maid. The dining-room door just beyond was open, and from the table in plain view a stout woman hastily arose and came toward them. Hastings caught a glimpse of a young man with a big head and several snuffy old gentlemen at breakfast before the door closed and the stout woman waddled into the room, bringing with her an aroma of coffee and a black poodle. "It is a plaisir to receive," she cried. "Monsieur is English? No? American? Of course. My pension it is for Americans for too. Here all speak English. C'est à dire the personnel, the servants do speak, plus moins a little. I am happy to have you come pensionnaire." "Madam," began Dr. Byram, but was cut short again. "Ah, yes, I know. Oh, mon Dieu! You do not speak French, but you have come to learn. My husband does speak French with the pensionnaire. We have at the moment a family Americain who learn of my husband French." Here the poodle growled at Dr. Byram, and was promptly cuffed by his mistress. Vous too, she cried with a slap. Vous too. Oh, le vilain! Oh, le vilain! Mais, madame, said Hastings, smiling, il n'a pas l'air très féroce. The poodle fled, and his mistress cried, "Ah, the accent! Charming! He does speak already French, like a Parisian young gentleman." Then Dr. Byram managed to get in a word or two, and gathered more or less information with regard to prices. "It is a pension sérieux. My clientèle is of the best. Indeed, a pension de famille, where one is at home." Then they went upstairs to examine Hastings' future quarters, test the bed springs, and arrange for the weekly towel allowance. Dr. Byram appeared satisfied. Madame Merrotte accompanied them to the door and rang for the maid. But as Hastings stepped out into the gravel walk, his guide and mentor paused a moment and fixed Madame with his watery eyes. "You understand," he said, "that he is a youth of most careful bringing up, and his character and morals are without a stain. He is young, and has never been abroad, never even seen a large city, and his parents have requested me, as an old family friend living in Paris, to see that he is placed under good influences. He is to study art, but on no account would his parents wish him to live in the Latin Quarter, if they knew of the immorality that is rife there." A sound like the click of a latch interrupted him, and he raised his eyes, but not in time to see the maid slap the big-headed young man behind the parlor door. Madame coughed, cast a deadly glance behind her, and then beamed on Dr. Byram. "It is well that he come here. The pension more serious. Il n'existe pas. It is not any," she announced with conviction. So, as there was nothing more to add, Dr. Byram joined Hastings at the gate. "I trust," he said, eyeing the convent, "that you will make no acquaintances among Jesuits." Hastings looked at the convent until a pretty girl passed before the gray façade, and then he looked at her. A young fellow with a paint box and canvas came swinging along, stopped before the pretty girl, said something during a brief but vigorous handshake, at which they both laughed, and he went his way, calling back, "À demain, Valentine," as in the same breath she cried, "À demain." Valentine, thought Hastings, what a quaint name, and he started to follow the Reverend Joel Byram, who was shuffling towards the nearest tramway station. Part 2. "And you are pleased with Paris, Monsieur Hastings?" demanded Madame Merrotte, the next morning, as Hastings came into the breakfast-room of the pension, rosy from his plunge in the limited bath above. "I am sure I shall like it," he replied, wondering at his own depression of spirits. The maid brought him coffee and rolls. He returned the vacant glance of the big-headed young man, and acknowledged diffidently the salutes of the snuffy old gentleman. He did not try to finish his coffee, and sat crumbling a roll, unconscious of the sympathetic glances of Madame Merrotte, who had tact enough not to bother him. Presently a maid entered with a tray on which were balanced 2 bowls of chocolate, and the snuffy old gentleman leered at her ankles. The maid deposited the chocolate at a table near the window, and smiled at Hastings. Then a thin young lady, followed by her counterpart in all except years, marched into the room and took the table near the window. They were evidently American, but Hastings, if he expected any sign of recognition, was disappointed. To be ignored by compatriots intensified his depression. He fumbled with his knife and looked at his plate. The thin young lady was talkative enough. She was quite aware of Hastings's presence, ready to be flattered if he looked at her, but on the other hand she felt her superiority, for she had been 3 weeks in Paris, and he, it was easy to see, had not yet unpacked his steamer trunk. Her conversation was complacent. She argued with her mother upon the relative merits of the Louvre and the Bon Marché, but her mother's part of the discussion was mostly confined to the observation, "Why, Susie!" The snuffy old gentleman had left the room in a body, outwardly polite and inwardly raging. They could not endure the Americans who filled the room with their chatter. The big-headed young man looked after them with a knowing cough, murmuring, "Gay old birds." "They look like bad old men, Mr. Bladen," said the girl. To this Mr. Bladen smiled and said, "They've had their day," in a tone which implied that he was now having his. "And that's why they all have baggy eyes," cried the girl. "I think it's a shame for young gentlemen—" "Why, Susie!" said the mother, and the conversation lagged. After a while Mr. Bladen threw down the Petit Journal, which he daily studied at the expense of the house, and turning to Hastings, started to make himself agreeable. He began by saying, "I see you are American." To this brilliant and original opening, Hastings, deadly homesick, replied gratefully, and the conversation was judiciously nourished by observations from Miss Susie Byng, distinctly addressed to Mr. Bladen. In the course of events, Miss Susie, forgetting to address herself exclusively to Mr. Bladen, and Hastings replying to her general question, the entente cordiale was established, and Susie and her mother extended a protectorate over what was clearly neutral territory. "Mr. Hastings, you must not desert the pension every evening as Mr. Bladen does. Paris is an awful place for young gentlemen, and Mr. Bladen is a horrid cynic." Mr. Bladen looked gratified. Hastings answered, "I shall be at the studio all day, and I imagine I shall be glad enough to come back at night." Mr. Bladen, who, at a salary of $15 a week, acted as agent for the Pewley Manufacturing Company of Troy, New York, smiled a skeptical smile and withdrew to keep an appointment with a customer on the Boulevard Magenta. Hastings walked into the garden with Mrs. Byng and Susie, and at their invitation sat down in the shade before the iron gate. The chestnut trees still bore their fragrant spikes of pink and white, and the bees hummed among the roses, trellised on the white-walled house. A faint freshness was in the air. The watering carts moved up and down the street, and a clear stream bubbled over the spotless gutters of the Rue de la Grande Chaumière. The sparrows were merry along the curbstones, taking bath after bath in the water, and ruffling their feathers with delight. In a walled garden across the street a pair of blackbirds whistled among the almond trees. Hastings swallowed the lump in his throat, for the song of the birds and the ripple of the water in a Paris gutter brought back to him the sunny meadows of Millbrook. "That's a blackbird," observed Miss Byng. "See him there on the bush with pink blossoms? He's all black except his bill, and that looks as if it had been dipped in an omelette, as some Frenchman says." "Why, Susie!" said Mrs. Byng. "That garden belongs to a studio inhabited by 2 Americans," continued the girl serenely, "and I often see them pass. They seem to need a great many models, mostly young and feminine." "Why, Susie!" "Perhaps they prefer painting that kind, but I don't see why they should invite 5, with 3 more young gentlemen, and all get into 2 cabs and drive away singing. This street," she continued, "is dull. There is nothing to see except the garden and a glimpse of the Boulevard Montparnasse through the Rue de la Grande Chaumière. No one ever passes except a policeman. There is a convent on the corner." "I thought it was a Jesuit college," began Hastings, but was at once overwhelmed with a Baedeker description of the place, ending with, "On one side stand the palatial hotels of Jean-Paul Lorrain and Guillaume Bouguereau, and opposite, in the little passage Stanislas, Carolus Duran paints the masterpieces which charm the world." The blackbird burst into a ripple of golden throaty notes. and from some distant green spot in the city an unknown wild bird answered with a frenzy of liquid trills until the sparrows paused in their ablutions to look up with restless chirps. Then a butterfly came and sat on a cluster of heliotrope, and waved his crimson-band wings in the hot sunshine. Hastings knew him for a friend, and before his eyes came a vision of tall mulleins and scented milkweed alive with painted wings, a vision of a white house and woodbine-covered piazza, a glimpse of a man reading and a woman leaning over the pansy bed, and his heart was full. He was startled a moment later by Miss Byng. "I believe you are homesick." Hastings blushed. Miss Byng looked at him with a sympathetic sigh and continued, "Whenever I felt homesick at first, I used to go with Mamma and walk in the Luxembourg Gardens. I don't know why it is, but those old-fashioned gardens seem to bring me nearer home than anything in this artificial city." "But they are full of marble statues," said Mrs. Byng mildly. "I don't see the resemblance myself." "Where is the Luxembourg?" inquired Hastings after a silence. "Come with me to the gate," said Miss Byng. He rose and followed her, and she pointed out the Rue Vavin at the foot of the street. "You pass by the convent at the right," she smiled, and Hastings went.
End of parts 1 and 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush, Marquette, Michigan, September 2006. The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. The Street of Our Lady of the Fields. Parts 3 and 4.
Part 3. The Luxembourg was a blaze of flowers. He walked slowly through the long avenues of trees, past mossy marbles and old-time columns, and threading the grove by the bronze lion, came upon the tree-crowned terrace above the fountain. Below lay the basin shining in the sunlight. Flowering almonds encircled the terrace, and in a greater spiral groves of chestnuts wound in and out and down among the moist thickets by the western palace wing. At one end of the avenue of trees the observatory rose, its white domes piled up like an eastern mosque. At the other end stood the heavy palace, with every window-pane ablaze in the fierce sun of June. Around the fountain, children and white-capped nurses, armed with bamboo poles, were pushing toy boats, whose sails hung limp in the sunshine. A dark policeman, wearing red epaulets and a dress-sword, watched them for a while, and then went away to remonstrate with a young man who had unchained his dog. The dog was pleasantly occupied in rubbing grass and dirt into his back, while his legs waved in the air. The policeman pointed at the dog. He was speechless with indignation. "Well, Captain?" smiled the young fellow. "Well, Monsieur Student?" growled the policeman. "What do you come and complain to me for?" "If you don't chain him, I'll take him," shouted the policeman. "What's that to me, mon capitaine?" "What? Isn't that bulldog yours?" "If it was, don't you suppose I'd chain him?" The officer glared for a moment in silence, then, deciding that as he was a student he was wicked, grabbed at the dog, who promptly dodged. Around and around the flower beds they raced, and when the officer came too near for comfort, the bulldog cut across a flower bed, which perhaps was not playing fair. The young man was amused, and the dog also seemed to enjoy the exercise. The policeman noticed this and decided to strike at the fountainhead of the evil. He stormed up to the student and said, "As the owner of this public nuisance, I arrest you." "But," objected the other, "I disclaim the dog." That was a poser. It was useless to attempt to catch the dog until 3 gardeners lent a hand. but then the dog simply ran away and disappeared in the Rue de Medici. The policeman shambled off to find consolation among the white-capped nurses, and the student, looking at his watch, stood up yawning. Then, catching sight of Hastings, he smiled and bowed. Hastings walked over to the marble, laughing. "Why, Clifford," he said, "I didn't recognize you." "It's my mustache," sighed the other. "I sacrificed it to humor a whim of a friend. What do you think of my dog?" "Then he is yours!" cried Hastings. "Of course. It's a pleasant change for him, this playing tag with policemen. But he is known now, and I'll have to stop it. He's gone home. He always does when the gardeners take a hand. It's a pity. He's fond of rolling on lawns." Then they chatted for a moment of Hastings' prospects, and Clifford politely offered to stand his sponsor at the studio. "You see, old Tabby, I mean Dr. Byram, told me about you before I met you," explained Clifford, "and Elliot and I will be glad to do anything we can." Then, looking at his watch again, he muttered, "I have just 10 minutes to catch the Versailles train. Au revoir," and started to go, but catching a sight of a girl advancing by the fountain, took off his hat with a confused smile. "Why are you not at Versailles?" she said, with an almost imperceptible acknowledgment of Hastings' presence. I'm going," murmured Clifford. For a moment they faced each other, and then Clifford, very red, stammered, "With your permission, I have the honor of presenting to you my friend, Monsieur Hastings." Hastings bowed low. She smiled very sweetly, but there was something of malice in the quiet inclination of her small Parisienne head. "I could have wished," she said, "that Monsieur Clifford might spare me more time when he brings with him so charming an American." Must I go, Valentine?" began Clifford. "Certainly," she replied. Clifford took his leave with very bad grace, wincing when she added, "And give my dearest love to Cécile." As he disappeared in the Rue d'Assas, the girl turned as if to go, but then suddenly remembering Hastings, looked at him and shook her head. "Monsieur Clifford is so perfectly harebrained," she smiled. "It is embarrassing sometimes. You have heard, of course, all about his success at the Salon." He looked puzzled, and she noticed it. "You have been to the Salon, of course." "Why, no," he answered. "I only arrived in Paris 3 days ago." She seemed to pay little heed to his explanation, but continued, "Nobody imagined he had the energy to do anything good, but on varnishing day the Salon was astonished by the entrance of Monsieur Clifford, who strolled about as bland as you please, with an orchid in his buttonhole and a beautiful picture on the line." She smiled to herself at the reminiscence, and looked at the fountain. "Monsieur Bouguereau told me that Monsieur Julien was so astonished that he only shook hands with Monsieur Clifford in a dazed manner, and actually forgot to pat him on the back. Fancy," she continued with much merriment, "fancy Papa Julien forgetting to pat one on the back." Hastings, wondering at her acquaintance with the great Bouguereau, looked at her with respect. "May I ask," he said diffidently, "whether you are a pupil of Bouguereau?" "I?" she said in some surprise. Then she looked at him curiously. Was he permitting himself the liberty of joking on such short acquaintance? His pleasant, serious face questioned hers. "Tiens," she thought, "what a droll man!" "You surely study art," he said. She leaned back on the crooked stick of her parasol and looked at him. "Why do you think so?" "Because you speak as if you did." "You are making fun of me," she said, "and it is not good taste." She stopped, confused, as he colored to the roots of his hair. "How long have you been in Paris?" she said at length. 3 days," he replied gravely. But surely you are not a nouveau. You speak French too well." Then after a pause, Really, are you a nouveau?"
"I am," he said. She sat down on the marble bench lately occupied by Clifford, and tilting her parasol over her small head, looked at him.
"I don't believe it."
He felt the compliment, and for a moment hesitated to declare himself one of the despised. Then, mustering up his courage, he told her how new and green he was, and all with a frankness which made her blue eyes open very wide, and her lips part in the sweetest of smiles.
"You have never seen a studio?"
"Never."
"Nor a model?"
"No."
"How funny," she said solemnly.
Then they both laughed. "And you," he said, "have seen studios?"
"Hundreds."
"And models?"
"Millions."
"And you know Bouguereau?"
"Yes, and Henner, and Constant, and Lorraine, and Puvis de Chavannes, and Dagnan, and Courtois, and all the rest of them."
"And yet you say you are not an artist."
"Pardon," she said gravely. "Did I say I was not?"
"Won't you tell me?" He hesitated. At first she looked at him, shaking her head and smiling. Then of a sudden her eyes fell, and she began tracing figures with her parasol in the gravel at her feet. Hastings had taken a place on the seat, and now, with his elbows on his knees, sat watching the spray drifting above the fountain jet. A small boy, dressed as a sailor, stood poking his yacht and crying, "I won't go home! I won't go home!" His nurse raised her hands to heaven. "Just like a little American boy," thought Hastings, and a pang of homesickness shot through him. Presently the nurse captured the boat, and the small boy stood at bay.
"Monsieur René, when you decide to come here, you may have your boat."
The boy backed away scowling.
"Give me my boat, I say," he cried, "and don't call me René, for my name's Randall, and you know it."
"Hello," said Hastings. "Randall? That's English."
"I am American,"
announced the boy in perfectly good English, turning to look at Hastings.
"and she's such a fool. She calls me René because Mama calls me Ranny."
Here he dodged the exasperated nurse, and took up his station behind Hastings, who laughed, and, catching him around the waist, lifted him into his lap. "One of my countrymen," he said to the girl beside him. He smiled while he spoke, but there was a queer feeling in his throat.
"Don't you see the stars and stripes on my yacht?"
demanded Randall. Sure enough, the American colors hung limply under the nurse's arm.
"Oh," cried the girl, "he is charming,"
and impulsively stooped to kiss him, but the infant Randall wriggled out of Hastings' arms, and his nurse pounced upon him with an angry glance at the girl. She reddened, and then bit her lips as the nurse, with eyes still fixed on her, dragged the child away, and ostentatiously wiped his lips with her handkerchief. Then she stole a look at Hastings, and bit her lip again. "What an ill-tempered woman," he said. "In America most nurses are flattered when people kiss their children." For an instant she tipped the parasol to hide her face, then closed it with a snap, and looked at him defiantly.
"Do you think it strange that she objected?"
"Why not?" he said in surprise. Again she looked at him with quick, searching eyes. His eyes were clear and bright, and he smiled back, repeating, "Why not?"
"You are droll," she murmured, bending her head.
"Why?" But she made no answer, and sat silent, tracing curves and circles in the dust with her parasol. After a while he said, "I am glad to see that young people have so much liberty here. I understood that the French were not at all like us. You know, in America, or at least where I live in Millbrook, girls have every liberty, go out alone and receive their friends alone, and I was afraid I should miss it here. But I see how it is now, and I am glad I was mistaken." She raised her eyes to his, and kept them there. He continued pleasantly, "Since I have sat here, I have seen a lot of pretty girls walking alone on the terrace there. And then you are alone too. Tell me, for I do not know French customs,
Do you have the liberty of going to the theatre without a chaperone?" For a long time she studied his face, and then with a trembling smile said, "Why do you ask me?" "Because you must know, of course," he said gaily. "Yes," she replied indifferently, "I know." He waited for an answer, but getting none, decided that perhaps she had misunderstood him. "I hope you don't think I mean to presume on our short acquaintance," he began. "In fact, it is very odd, but I don't know your name. When Mr. Clifford presented me, he only mentioned mine. Is that the custom in France?" "It is the custom in the Latin Quarter," she said with a queer light in her eyes. Then suddenly she began talking almost feverishly. "You must know, Monsieur Hastings, that we are all un peu sans gêne here in the Latin Quarter. We are very bohemian, and etiquette and ceremony are out of place. It was for that Monsieur Clifford presented you to me with small ceremony, and left us together with less. Only for that, and I am his friend, and I have many friends in the Latin Quarter, and we all know each other very well, and I am not studying art, but... "But what?" he said, bewildered. "I shall not tell you. It is a secret," she said with an uncertain smile. On both cheeks a pink spot was burning, and her eyes were very bright. Then in a moment her face fell. "Do you know Monsieur Clifford very intimately?" "Not very." After a while she turned to him, grave and a little pale. "My name is Valentine Tissot. Might I ask a service of you on such very short acquaintance?" "Oh," he cried, "I should be honored." "It is only this," she said gently. "It is not much. Promise me not to speak to Monsieur Clifford about me. Promise me that you will speak to no one about me." "I promise," he said, greatly puzzled. She laughed nervously. "I wish to remain a mystery. It is a caprice." "But," he began, I had hoped that you might give Monsieur Clifford permission to bring me, to present me at your house." My house?" she repeated. "I mean where you live. In fact, to present me to your family." The change in the girl's face shocked him. "I beg your pardon," he cried. "I have hurt you." And as quick as a flash she understood him because she was a woman. "My parents are dead," she said. Presently he began again, very gently. "Would it displease you if I beg you to receive me? It is the custom?" "I cannot," she answered. Then glancing up at him, "I am sorry. I should like to, but believe me, I cannot." He bowed seriously and looked vaguely uneasy. "It isn't because I don't wish to. I like you. You are very kind to me." "Kind?" he cried, surprised and puzzled. "I like you," she said slowly, "and we will see each other sometimes, if you will." "At friends' houses?" "No, not at friends' houses." "Where?" "Here," she said with defiant eyes. "Why," he cried, "in Paris you are much more liberal in your views than we are." She looked at him curiously. "Yes, we are very bohemian." "I think it is charming," he declared. "You see, we shall be in the best of society," she ventured timidly, with a pretty gesture toward the statues of the dead queens, ranged in stately ranks above the terrace. He looked at her delighted, and she brightened at the success of her innocent little pleasantry. "Indeed," she smiled, "I shall be well chaperoned, because you see we are under the protection of the gods themselves. Look, there are Apollo and Juno and Venus on their pedestals," counting them on her small gloved fingers, "and Ceres, Hercules, but I can't make out—" Hastings turned to look up at the winged god under whose shadow they were seated. "Why, it's love!" he said. Part 4. "There is a nouveau here," drawled Laffatte, leaning around his easel and addressing his friend Bowles. "There is a nouveau here, who is so tender and green and appetizing that heaven help him if he should fall into a salad bowl." "Hayseed?" inquired Bowles, plastering in a background with a broken palette knife and squinting at the effect with approval. "Yes, Squeedunk or Oshkosh, and how he ever grew up among the daisies and escaped the cows, heaven alone knows." Bowles rubbed his thumb against the outlines of his study to "throw in a little atmosphere," as he said, glared at the model, pulled at his pipe, and finding it out, struck a match on his neighbor's back to relight it. "His name," continued Laffatte, hurling a bit of bread at the hat rack, "his name is Hastings. He is a Barry. He knows no more about the world," and here Mr. Laffatte's face spoke volumes for his own knowledge of that planet, "than a maiden cat on its first moonlight stroll." Bowles, now having succeeded in lighting his pipe, repeated the thumb touch on the other edge of the study, and said, "Ah!" "Yes," continued his friend, "and would you imagine it? He seems to think that everything here goes on as it does in his damned little backwoods ranch at home. Talks about the pretty girls who walk alone in the street, says how sensible it is, and how French parents are misrepresented in America. Says that for his part he finds French girls, and he confessed to only knowing one, as jolly as American girls. I tried to set him right, tried to give him a pointer as to what sort of ladies walk about alone or with students, and he was either too stupid or too innocent to catch on. Then I gave it to him straight, and he said I was a vile-minded fool and marched off." "Did you assist him with your shoe?" inquired Bowles, languidly interested. "Well, no." "He called you a vile-minded fool." "He was correct," said Clifford from the easel in front. What do you mean?" demanded Laffatte, turning red. "That," replied Clifford. "Who spoke to you? Is this your business?" sneered Bowles, but nearly lost his balance as Clifford swung about and eyed him. "Yes," he said slowly, "it's my business." No one spoke for some time. Then Clifford sang out, "I say, Hastings!" And when Hastings left his easel and came around, he nodded toward the astonished Laffatte. "This man has been disagreeable to you, and I want to tell you that any time you feel inclined to kick him, why, I will hold the other creature." Hastings, embarrassed, said, "Why, no, I don't agree with his ideas, nothing more." Clifford said, "Naturally," and slipping his arm through Hastings, strolled about with him, and introduced him to several of his own friends, at which all of the nouveaux opened their eyes with envy, and the studio were given to understand that Hastings, although prepared to do menial work as the latest nouveau, was already within the charmed circle of the old, respected, and feared, and truly great. The rest finished, the model resumed his place, and work went on in a chorus of songs and yells, and every ear-splitting noise which the art students uttered when studying the beautiful. 5 o'clock struck, the model yawned, stretched, and climbed into his trousers, and the noisy contents of 6 studios crowded through the hall, and down into the street. 10 minutes later, Hastings found himself on top of a Montrouge tram, and shortly afterward was joined by Clifford. They climbed down at the Rue Gay-Lussac. "I always stop here," observed Clifford. "I like the walk through the Luxembourg." "By the way," said Hastings, "how can I call on you when I don't know where you live?" "Why, I live opposite you." "What, the studio in the garden where the almond trees are and the blackbirds?" "Exactly," said Clifford. "I'm with my friend Elliot." Hastings thought of the description of the 2 American artists which he had heard from Miss Susie Byng, and looked blank. Clifford continued, "Perhaps you had better let me know when you think of coming, so that I will be sure to be there," he ended rather lamely. "I shouldn't care to meet any of your model friends there," said Hastings, smiling. "You know, my ideas are rather straight-laced. I suppose you would say puritanical. I shouldn't enjoy it, and wouldn't know how to behave." "Oh, I understand," said Clifford, but added with great cordiality, "I'm sure we'll be friends, although you may not approve of me and my set. But you will like Severn and Selby, because, well, they are like yourself, old chap." After a moment he continued, "There is something I want to speak about. You see, when I introduced you last week in the Luxembourg to Valentine—" "Not a word," cried Hastings, smiling. "You must not tell me a word of her." "Why, no, not a word," he said gaily. "I insist. Promise me upon your honor you will not speak of her until I give you permission. Promise?" "I promise," said Clifford, amazed. "She is a charming girl. We had such a delightful chat after you left, and I thank you for presenting me. But not another word about her until I give you permission." "Oh," murmured Clifford. "Remember your promise," he smiled as he turned into his gateway. Clifford strolled across the street, and, traversing the ivy-covered alley, entered his garden. He felt for his studio key, muttering, I wonder, but of course he doesn't." He entered the hallway and, fitting the key into the door, stood staring at the 2 cards tacked over the panels. Foxhall Clifford, Richard Osborne Elliott. Why the devil doesn't he want me to speak of her? He opened the door, and, discouraging the caresses of 2 brindle bulldogs, sat down on the sofa. Elliott sat smoking and sketching with a piece of charcoal by the window. "Hello," he said, without looking around. Clifford gazed absently at the back of his head, murmuring, I'm afraid that man is too innocent. I say, Elliott," he said at last. "Hastings, you know the chap that old Tabby Byram came around here to tell us about? The day you had to hide Colette in the armoire." "Yes, what's up?" "Oh, nothing. He's a brick." "Yes," said Elliott, without enthusiasm. "Don't you think so?" demanded Clifford. "Why, yes, but he is going to have a tough time when some of his illusions are dispelled." "More shame to those who dispel 'em." "Yes. Wait until he comes to pay his call on us, unexpectedly, of course." Clifford looked virtuous and lighted a cigar. "I was just going to say," he observed, "that I have asked him not to come without letting us know, so I can postpone any orgy you may have intended." "Ah," cried Elliott indignantly, "I suppose you put it to him in that way." "Not exactly," grinned Clifford. Then more seriously, "I don't want anything to occur here to bother him. He's a brick, and it's a pity we can't be more like him." "I am," observed Elliott complacently, "only living with you—" "Listen," cried the other, "I have managed to put my foot in it in great style. Do you know what I've done? Well, the first time I met him in the street, or rather it was in the Luxembourg, I introduced him to Valentine." "Did he object?" "Believe me," said Clifford solemnly, "this rustic Hastings has no more idea that Valentine is Valentine than he has that he himself is a beautiful example of moral decency in a quarter where morals are as rare as elephants. I heard enough in a conversation between that blackguard Laffatte and the little immoral eruption Bowles to open my eyes. I tell you, Hastings is a trump. He is a healthy, clean-minded young fellow, bred in a small country village, brought up with the idea that saloons are way stations to hell, and as for women—" "Well?" demanded Elliott. "Well," said Clifford, "his idea of the dangerous woman is probably a painted Jezebel." "Probably," replied the other. "He's a trump," said Clifford, "and if he swears the world is as good and pure as his own heart, I'll swear he's right." Elliott rubbed his charcoal on his file to get a point and turned to his sketch, saying, "He will never hear any pessimism from Richard Osborne E." "He's a lesson to me," said Clifford. Then he unfolded a small perfumed note, written on rose-colored paper, which had been lying on the table before him. He read it, smiled, whistled a bar or two from Miss Heliot, and sat down to answer it on his best cream-laid note-paper. When it was written and sealed, he picked up his stick and marched up and down the studio 2 or 3 times whistling. "Going out?" inquired the other without turning. "Yes," he said, but lingered a moment over Elliott's shoulder, watching him pick out the lights in his sketch with a bit of bread. "Tomorrow is Sunday," he observed after a moment's silence. "Well?" inquired Elliott. "Have you seen Colette?" "No, I will tonight. She and Rowden and Jacqueline are coming to Boulant's. I suppose you and Cecile will be there?" "Well, no," replied Clifford. "Cecile dines at home tonight, and I had an idea of going to Mignon's." Elliott looked at him with disapproval. "You can make all the arrangements for La Roche without me," he continued, avoiding Elliott's eyes. "What are you up to now?" "Nothing," protested Clifford. "Don't tell me," replied his chum with scorn. "Fellows don't rush off to Mignon's when the set dine at Boulant's. Who is it now? But no, I won't ask that. What's the use?" Then he lifted up his voice in complaint and beat upon the table with his pipe. "What's the use of ever trying to keep track of you? What will Cecile say? Oh yes, what will she say? It's a pity you can't be constant 2 months. Yes, by Jove! And the Quarter is indulgent, but you abuse its good nature, and mine too." Presently he arose, and jamming his hat on his head, marched to the door. "Heaven alone knows why any one puts up with your antics, but they all do, and so do I. If I were Cecile, or any of the other pretty fools after whom you have toddled, and will in all human probabilities continue to toddle, I say, if I were Cecile, I'd spank you. Now I'm going to Boulant's, and as usual I shall make excuses for you and arrange the affair. And I don't care a continental where you are going. But by the skull of the studio skeleton, if you don't turn up tomorrow with your sketching kit under one arm and Cecile under the other, if you don't turn up in good shape, I'm done with you, and the rest can think what they please. Good night." Clifford said good night with as pleasant a smile as he could muster, and then sat down with his eyes on the door. He took out his watch and gave Elliott 10 minutes to vanish, then rang the concierge's call, murmuring, oh dear, why the devil do I do it?" "Alfred," he said, as that gimlet-eyed person answered the call, "make yourself clean and proper, Alfred, and replace your sabot with a pair of shoes. Then put on your best hat, and take this letter to the big white house in the Rue du Dragon. There is no answer, mon petit Alfred." The concierge departed with a snort, in which unwillingness for the errand and affection for Monsieur Clifford were blended. Then with great care the young fellow arrayed himself in all the beauties of his and Elliott's wardrobe. He took his time about it, and occasionally interrupted his toilet to play his banjo or make pleasing diversion for the bulldogs by gambling about on all fours. "I've got 2 hours before me," he thought, and borrowed a pair of Elliott's silken foot-gear, with which he and the dogs played ball until he decided to put them on. Then he lighted a cigarette and inspected his dress-coat. When he had emptied it of 4 handkerchiefs, a fan, and a pair of crumpled gloves as long as his arm, he decided it was not suited to add éclat to his charms, and cast about in his mind for a substitute. Elliott was too thin, and anyway his coats were now under lock and key. Rowden probably was as badly off as himself. Hastings was the man. But when he threw on a smoking jacket and sauntered over to Hastings' house, he was informed that he had been gone over an hour. "Now where in the name of all that's reasonable could he have gone?" muttered Clifford, looking down the street. The maid didn't know, so he bestowed upon her a fascinating smile and lounged back to the studio. Hastings was not far away. The Luxembourg is within 5 minutes' walk of the Rue Notre Dame des Champs, and there he sat under the shadow of a winged god, and there he had sat for an hour, poking holes in the dust and watching the steps which led from the northern terrace to the fountain. The sun hung, a purple globe, above the misty hills of Meudon. Long streamers of clouds touched with rose swept low on the western sky, and the dome of the distant Invalides burned like an opal through the haze. Behind the palace the smoke from a high chimney mounted straight into the air, purple until it crossed the sun, where it changed to a bar of smoldering fire. High above the darkening foliage of the chestnuts the twin towers of St. Sulpice rose, an ever-deepening silhouette. A sleepy blackbird was carolling in some near thicket, and pigeons passed and repassed with the whisper of soft winds in their wings. The light on the palace windows had died away, and the dome of the Pantheon swam aglow above the northern terrace, a fiery Valhalla in the sky, while below, in grim array, along the terrace ranged, the marble ranks of queens looked out into the west. From the end of the long walk by the northern façade of the palace came the noise of omnibuses and the cries of the street. Hastings looked at the palace clock. 6. And as his own watch agreed with it, he fell to poking holes in the gravel again. A constant stream of people passed between the Odeon and the fountain. Priests in black, with silver-buckled shoes, line soldiers, slouchy and rakish, neat girls without hats bearing milliners' boxes, students with black portfolios and high hats, students with berets and big canes, nervous, quick-stepping officers, symphonies in turquoise and silver, ponderous, jangling cavalrymen all over dust, pastry cooks' boys skipping along with utter disregard for the safety of the basket balanced on the impish head, and then the lean outcast, the shambling Paris tramp, slouching with shoulders bent, and little eye furtively scanning the ground for smokers' refuse. All these moved in a steady stream across the fountain circle and out into the city by the Odeon, whose long arcades were now beginning to flicker with gas jets. The melancholy bells of St. Sulpice struck the hour, and the clock tower of the palace lighted up. Then hurried steps sounded across the gravel, and Hastings raised his head. "How late you are!" he said, but his voice was hoarse, and only his flushed face told how long had seemed the waiting. She said,
"I was kept, indeed. I was so much annoyed, and I may only stay a moment."
She sat down beside him, casting a furtive glance over her shoulder at the god upon his pedestal.
"What a nuisance! That intruding Cupid still there?"
"Wings and arrows, too," said Hastings, unheeding her motion to be seated.
"Wings," she murmured. "Oh, yes, to fly away with when he's tired of his play. Of course, it was a man who conceived the idea of wings. Otherwise, Cupid would have been insupportable."
"Do you think so?"
"Ma foi, it's what men think."
"And women?"
"Oh,"
she said with a toss of her small head,
"I really forgot what we were speaking of."
"We were speaking of love," said Hastings.
"I was not,"
said the girl. Then looking up at the marble god,
"I don't care for this one at all. I don't believe he knows how to shoot his arrows. No, indeed, he is a coward. He creeps up like an assassin in the twilight. I don't approve of cowardice," she announced, and turned her back on the statue. "I think," said Hastings quietly, "that he does shoot fairly, yes, and even gives one warning." "Is that your experience, Monsieur Hastings?"
He looked straight into her eyes and said, "He is warning me."
"Heed the warning, then,"
she cried with a nervous laugh. As she spoke she stripped off her gloves, and then carefully proceeded to draw them on again. When this was accomplished, she glanced at the palace clock, saying,
"Oh dear, how late it is!"
furled her umbrella, then unfurled it, and finally looked at him. "No," he said, "I shall not heed his warning."
"Oh dear," she sighed again. "Still talking about that tiresome statue?"
Then, stealing a glance at his face,
I suppose you are in love?"
I don't know," he muttered. "I suppose I am." She raised her head with a quick glance.
"You seem delighted at the idea,"
she said, but bit her lip and trembled as his eyes met hers. Then sudden fear came over her, and she sprang up, staring into the gathering shadows. "Are you cold?" he said, but she only answered,
oh dear, it is late, so late. I must go. Good night."
She gave him her gloved hand a moment, and then withdrew it with a start. "What is it?" he insisted. "Are you frightened?" She looked at him strangely.
No, not frightened. You are very good to me."
"By Jove!" he burst out. "What do you mean by saying I'm good to you? That's at least the third time, and I don't understand." The sound of a drum from the guard house at the palace cut him short.
"Listen," she whispered.
They are going to close. It's late. Oh, so late." The rolling of the drum came nearer and nearer, and then the silhouette of the drummer cut the sky above the eastern terrace. The fading light lingered a moment on his belt and bayonet, then he passed into the shadows, drumming the echoes awake. The roll became fainter along the eastern terrace, then grew and rattled with increasing sharpness when he passed the avenue by the Bronze Lion and turned down the western terrace walk. Louder and louder the drum sounded, and the echoes struck back the notes from the gray palace wall, and now the drummer loomed up before them, his red trousers a dull spot in the gathering gloom, the brass of his drum and bayonet touched with a pale spark, his epaulets tossing on his shoulders. He passed, leaving the crash of the drum in their ears, and far into the alley of trees they saw his little tin cup shining on his haversack. Then the sentinels began the monotonous cry, "Enfermez! Enfermez!" and the bugle blew from the barracks in the Rue de Tournon, "Enfermez! Enfermez!" "Good night," she whispered. "I must return alone tonight." He watched her until she reached the northern terrace, and then sat down on the marble seat until a hand on his shoulder and a glimmer of bayonets warned him away. She passed on through the grove, and turning into the Rue de Medici, traversed it to the boulevard. At the corner she bought a bunch of violets and walked on along the boulevard to the Rue des Écoles. A cab was drawn up before Boulant's, and a pretty girl, aided by Elliott, jumped out. "Valentine!" cried the girl. "Come with us!" "I can't," she said, stopping a moment. "I have a rendezvous at Mignon's." "Not Victor?" cried the girl, laughing, but she passed with a little shiver, nodding good night. Then, turning into the Boulevard Saint Germain, she walked a little faster to escape a gay party sitting before the Café Cluny, who called to her to join them. At the door of the Restaurant Mignon stood a coal-black negro in buttons. He took off his peaked cap as she mounted the carpeted stairs. "Send Eugene to me," she said at the office, and passing through the hallway to the right of the dining room stopped before a row of panelled doors. A waiter passed, and she repeated her demand for Eugene, who presently appeared, noiselessly skipping, and bowed, murmuring, "Madame." "Who is here?" "No one in the cabinets, madame. In the half, Madame Madeleine and Monsieur Guy, Monsieur de Clermont, Monsieur Clisson, Madame Marie, and their set." Then he looked around, and bowing again, murmured, "Monsieur awaits madame since half an hour," and he knocked at one of the panelled doors bearing the number 6. Clifford opened the door, and the girl entered. The garçon bowed her in, and whispering, "Will monsieur have the goodness to ring?" vanished. He helped her off with her jacket, and took her hat and umbrella. When she was seated at the little table with Clifford opposite, she smiled and leaned forward on both elbows, looking him in the face. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Waiting," he replied in accents of adoration. For an instant she turned and examined herself in the glass. The wide blue eyes, the curling hair, the straight nose and short curled lip flashed in the mirror an instant only, and then its depths reflected her pretty neck and back. "Thus do I turn my back on vanity," she said, and then leaning forward again, "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you," repeated Clifford, slightly troubled. "And Cecile?" "Now don't, Valentine." "Do you know," she said calmly, "I dislike your conduct." He was a little disconcerted, and rang for Eugene to cover his confusion. The soup was bisque, and the wine Pommery, and the courses followed each other with the usual regularity until Eugene brought coffee, and there was nothing left on the table but a small silver lamp. "Valentine," said Clifford, after having obtained permission to smoke, "is it the Vaudeville or the Eldorado, or both, or the Nouveau Cirque, or—" "It is here," said Valentine. "Well," he said, greatly flattered, "I'm afraid I couldn't amuse you." "Oh, yes, you are funnier than the Eldorado." "Now see here, don't guy me, Valentine. You always do, and you know what they say, a good laugh kills." "What?" love and all that." She laughed until her eyes were moist with tears. "Tien," she cried, "he is dead, then?" Clifford eyed her with growing alarm. "Do you know why I came?" she said. "No," he replied uneasily, "I don't." "How long have you made love to me?" "Well," he admitted, somewhat startled, "I should say for about a year." "It is a year, I think. Are you not tired?" He did not answer. "Don't you know that I like you too well to ever fall in love with you?" she said. "Don't you know that we are too good comrades, too old friends for that? And were we not... Do you think that I do not know your history, Monsieur Clifford?"
Don't be so sarcastic," he urged. "Don't be unkind, Valentine."
"I'm not. I'm kind. I'm very kind. To you and to Cécile."
"Cécile is tired of me."
"I hope she is," said the girl, "for she deserves a better fate. Tien, do you know your reputation in the quarter? Of the inconstant, the most inconstant, utterly incorrigible, and no more serious than a gnat on a summer night. Poor Cécile!"
Clifford looked so uncomfortable that she spoke more kindly.
"I like you. You know that. Everybody does. You are a spoiled child here. Everything is permitted you, and everyone makes allowance. But everyone cannot be a victim to caprice."
"Caprice!" he cried. "By Jove! If the girls of the Latin Quarter are not capricious!"
Never mind about that. You must not sit in judgment. You of all men! Why are you here tonight? Oh," she cried, "I will tell you why. Monsieur receives a little note. He sends a little answer. He dresses in his conquering raiment."
"I don't," said Clifford, very red.
"You do, and it becomes you," she retorted with a faint smile.
Then again, very quietly,
"I am in your power, but I know I am in the power of a friend. I have come to acknowledge it to you here, and it is because of that I am here to beg of you a favor."
Clifford opened his eyes, but said nothing.
"I am in great distress of mind. It is Monsieur Hastings."
"Well?" said Clifford, in some astonishment.
"I want to ask you," she continued in a low voice, "I want to ask you to, in case you should speak of me before him, not to say...
"I shall not speak of you to him," he said quietly.
Can you prevent others?"
"I might if I was present. May I ask why?"
"That is not fair," she murmured. "You know how he considers me, as he considers every woman. You know how different he is from you and the rest. I have never seen a man, such a man as Monsieur Hastings."
He let his cigarette go out unnoticed.
"I am almost afraid of him, afraid he should know what we all are in the quarter. Oh, I do not wish him to know. I do not wish him to turn from me, to cease from speaking to me as he does. You and the rest cannot know what it has been to me. I could not believe him. I could not believe he was so good and noble. I do not wish him to know so soon. He will find out sooner or later. He will find out for himself, and then he will turn away from me. Why?" she cried passionately. "Why should he turn from me and not from you?"
Clifford, much embarrassed, eyed his cigarette. The girl rose, very white.
"He is your friend. You have a right to warn him."
"He is my friend," he said at length. They looked at each other in silence. Then she cried,
"By all that I hold to me most sacred, you need not warn him."
"I shall trust your word," he said pleasantly.
End of parts 3 and 4.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush, Marquette, Michigan, September 2006.
The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. The Street of Our Lady of the Fields. Parts 5 and 6.
Part 5. The month passed quickly for Hastings, and left few definite impressions after it. It did leave some, however. One was a painful impression of meeting Mr. Bladen on the Boulevard des Capucines, in company with a very pronounced young person whose laugh dismayed him. And when at last he escaped from the cafe where Mr. Bladen had hauled him to join them in a walk, he felt as if the whole boulevard was looking at him and judging him by his company. Later, an instinctive conviction regarding the young person with Mr. Bladen sent the hot blood into his cheek, and he returned to the pension in such a miserable state of mind that Miss Byng was alarmed and advised him to conquer his homesickness at once. Another impression was equally vivid. One Saturday morning, feeling lonely, his wanderings about the city brought him to the Gare Saint-Lazare. It was early for breakfast, but he entered the Hotel Terminus and took a table near the window. As he wheeled about to give his order, a man passing rapidly along the aisle collided with his head, and looking up to receive the expected apology, he was met instead by a slap on the shoulder and a hearty, "What the deuce are you doing here, old chap?" It was Rowden, who seized him and told him to come along. So, mildly protesting, he was ushered into a private dining room, where Clifford, rather red, jumped up from the table and welcomed him with a startled air which was softened by the unaffected glee of Rowden and the extreme courtesy of Elliot. The latter presented him to 3 bewitching girls, who welcomed him so charmingly, and seconded Rowden in his demand that Hastings should make one of the party, that he consented at once. While Elliot briefly outlined the projected excursion to La Roche, Hastings delightedly ate his omelette, and returned the smiles of encouragement from Cecile, Colette, and Jacqueline. Meantime, Clifford, in a bland whisper, was telling Rowden what an ass he was. Poor Rowden looked miserable, until Elliot, divining how affairs were turning, frowned on Clifford and found a moment to let Rowden know that they were all going to make the best of it. "You shut up," he observed to Clifford. "It's fate, and that settles it." "It's Rowden, and that settles it," murmured Clifford, concealing a grin, for after all he was not Hastings's wet nurse. So it came about that the train which left the Gare Saint-Lazare at 9:15 a.m. stopped a moment in its career towards Havre, and deposited at the red-roofed station of La Roche a merry party, armed with sunshades, trout rods, and one cane, carried by the non-combatant Hastings. Then, when they had established their camp in a grove of sycamores which bordered the little river Epte, Clifford, the acknowledged master of all that pertained to sportsmanship, took command. "You, Rowden," he said, "divide your flies with Elliot and keep an eye on him, or else he'll be trying to put on a float and sinker. Prevent him by force for grubbing about for worms." Elliot protested, but was forced to smile in the general laugh. "You make me ill," he asserted. "Do you think this is my first trout?" "I shall be delighted to see your first trout," said Clifford, and dodging a fly hook, hurled with intent to hit, proceeded to sort and equip 3 slender rods destined to bring joy and fish to Cecile, Colette, and Jacqueline. With perfect gravity he ornamented each line with 4 split shot, a small hook, and a brilliant quill float. "I shall never touch the worms," announced Cecile with a shudder. Jacqueline and Colette hastened to sustain her, and Hastings pleasantly offered to act in the capacity of general baiter and taker-off of fish. But Cecile, doubtless fascinated by the gaudy flies in Clifford's book, decided to accept lessons from him in the true art, and presently disappeared up the Epte with Clifford in tow. Elliot looked doubtfully at Colette. "I prefer gudgeons," said the damsel with decision, "and you and Monsieur Rowden may go away when you please, May they not, Jacqueline?" "Certainly," responded Jacqueline. Elliot, undecided, examined his rod and reel. "You've got your reel on wrong side up," observed Rowden. Elliot wavered, and stole a glance at Colette. I have almost decided not to flip the flies about just now," he began. "There's the pole that Cecile left." "Don't call it a pole," corrected Rowden. "Rod, then," continued Elliot, and started off in the wake of the two girls, but was promptly collared by Rowden. "No, you don't. Fancy a man fishing with a float and sinker, when he has a fly rod in his hand. You come along." Where the placid little Ept flows down between its thickets to the Seine, a grassy bank shadows the haunt of the gudgeon, and on this bank sat Colette and Jacqueline, and chattered and laughed and watched the swerving of the scarlet quills, while Hastings, his hat over his eyes, his head on a bank of moss, listened to their soft voices and gallantly unhooked the small and indignant gudgeon when a flash of a rod and a half-suppressed scream announced a catch. The sunlight filtered through the leafy thickets, awaking to song the forest birds. Magpies in spotless black and white flirted past, alighting near by with a hop and bound and twitch of the tail. Blue and white jays with rosy breasts shrieked through the trees, and a low-sailing hawk wheeled among the fields of ripened wheat, putting to flight flocks of twittering hedge-birds. Across the Seine a gull dropped on the water like a plume. The air was pure and still, scarcely a leaf moved. Sounds from a distant farm came faintly, the shrill cock-crow and dull baying. Now and then a steam-tug with big raking smoke-pipe, bearing the name Butte 27, plowed up the river dragging its interminable train of barges, or a sailboat dropped down with the current toward sleepy Rouen. A faint fresh odor of earth and water hung in the air, and through the sunlight orange-tipped butterflies danced above the marsh grass. Soft, velvety butterflies flapped through the mossy woods. Hastings was thinking of Valentine. It was 2 o'clock when Elliot strolled back, and frankly admitting that he had eluded Rowden, sat down beside Colette and prepared to doze with satisfaction. "Where are your trout?" said Colette severely. "They still live," murmured Elliot, and went fast asleep. Rowden returned shortly after, and casting a scornful glance at the slumbering one, displayed 3 crimson-flecked trout. "And that," smiled Hastings lazily, "that is the holy end to which the faithful plod, the slaughter of these small fish with a bit of silk and feather." Rowden disdained to answer him. Colette caught another gudgeon and awoke Elliot, who protested and gazed about for the lunch baskets. As Clifford and Cecile came up demanding instant refreshment. Cecile's skirts were soaked and her gloves torn, but she was happy, and Clifford, dragging out a 2-pound trout, stood still to receive the applause of the company. "Where the deuce did you get that?" demanded Elliot. Cecile, wet and enthusiastic, recounted the battle, and then Clifford eulogized her powers with the fly, and in proof produced from his creel a defunct chub, which he observed just missed being a trout. They were all very happy at luncheon, and Hastings was voted charming. He enjoyed it immensely, only it seemed to him at moments that flirtation went further in France than in Millbrook, Connecticut, and he thought that Cecile might be a little less enthusiastic about Clifford, that perhaps it would be quite as well if Jacqueline sat further away from Rowden, and that possibly Colette could have, for a moment at least, taken her eyes from Elliot's face. Still, he enjoyed it, except when his thoughts drifted to Valentine, and then he felt that he was very far away from her. La Roche is at least an hour and a half from Paris. It is also true that he felt a happiness, a quick heart-beat when, at 8 o'clock that night, the train which bore them from La Roche rolled into the Gare Saint-Lazare, and he was once more in the city of Valentine. "Good night," they said, pressing around him. "You must come with us next time." He promised, and watched them 2 by 2 drifting into the darkening city, and stood so long that, when again he raised his eyes, the vast boulevard was twinkling with gas jets, through which the electric lights stared like moons. Part 6. It was with another quick heartbeat that he awoke next morning, for his first thought was of Valentine. The sun already gilded the towers of Notre Dame. The clatter of workmen's sabots awoke sharp echoes in the street below, and across the way a blackbird in a pink almond tree was going into an ecstasy of trills. He determined to awake Clifford for a brisk walk in the country, hoping later to beguile that gentleman into the American church for his soul's sake. He found Alfred, the gimlet-eyed, washing the asphalt walk which led to the studio. "Monsieur Elliot?" he replied to the perfunctory inquiry. "Je ne sais pas." "And Monsieur Clifford?" began Hastings, somewhat astonished. "Monsieur Clifford," said the concierge with fine irony, "will be pleased to see you, as he retired early. In fact, he has just come in." Hastings hesitated while the concierge pronounced a fine eulogy on people who never stayed out all night, and then came battering at the lodge gate during hours which even a gendarme held sacred to sleep. He also discoursed eloquently upon the beauties of temperance, and took an ostentatious draught from the fountain in the court. "I do not think I will come in," said Hastings. "Pardon, monsieur," growled the concierge. "Perhaps it would be well to see Monsieur Clifford. He possibly needs aid. Me, he drives forth with hair-brushes and boots. It is a mercy if he has not set fire to something with his candle." Hastings hesitated for an instant, but swallowing his dislike of such a mission, walked slowly through the ivy-covered alley and across the inner garden to the studio. He knocked. Perfect silence. Then he knocked again, and this time something struck the door from within with a crash. "That," said the concierge, "was a boot." He fitted his duplicate key into the lock and ushered Hastings in. Clifford, in disordered evening dress, sat on the rug in the middle of the room. He held in his hand a shoe, and did not appear astonished to see Hastings. "Good morning. Do you use Pear's soap?" he inquired with a vague wave of his hand and a vaguer smile. Hastings' heart sank. "For heaven's sake," he said, "Clifford, go to bed." "Not while that Alfred pokes his shaggy head in here and I have a shoe left." Hastings blew out the candle, picked up Clifford's hat and cane, and said, with an emotion he could not conceal, "This is terrible, Clifford. I never knew you did this sort of thing." "Well, I do," said Clifford. "Where is Elliot?" "Old chap," returned Clifford, becoming maudlin. "Providence which feeds sparrows and that sort of thing watcheth over the intemperate wanderer." "Where is Elliot?" But Clifford only wagged his head and waved his arm about. "He's out there, somewhere about." Then suddenly feeling a desire to see his missing chum, lifted up his voice and howled for him. Hastings, thoroughly shocked, sat down on the lounge without a word. Presently, after shedding several scalding tears, Clifford brightened up, and rose with great precaution. "Old chap," he observed, "do you want to see miracle? Well, here goes. I'm going to begin." He paused, beaming at vacancy. Miracle," he repeated. Hastings supposed he was alluding to the miracle of his keeping his balance, and said nothing. "I'm going to bed," he announced. "Poor old Clifford's going to bed, and that's miracle." And he did, with a nice calculation of distance and equilibrium which would have wrung enthusiastic yells of applause from Elliot had he been there to assist en connaisseur. But he was not. He had not yet reached the studio. He was on his way, however, and smiled with magnificent condescension on Hastings, who, half an hour later, found him reclining upon a bench in the Luxembourg. He permitted himself to be aroused, dusted, and escorted to the gate. Here, however, he refused all further assistance, and bestowing a patronizing bow upon Hastings, steered a tolerably true course for the Rue Vavin. Hastings watched him out of sight, and then slowly retraced his steps toward the fountain. At first he felt gloomy and depressed, but gradually the clear air of the morning lifted the pressure from his heart, and he sat down on the marble seat under the shadow of the winged god. The air was fresh and sweet with perfume from the orange flowers. Everywhere pigeons were bathing, dashing the water over their iris-hued breasts, flashing in and out of the spray, or nestling almost to the neck along the polished basin. The sparrows, too, were abroad in force, soaking their dust-colored feathers in the limpid pool, and chirping with might and main, which surrounded the duck-pond opposite the fountain of Marie de Medici. The waterfowl cropped the herbage, or waddled in rows down the bank to embark on some solemn, aimless cruise. Butterflies, somewhat lame from a chilly night's repose under the lilac leaves, crawled over and over the white phlox, or took a rheumatic flight toward some sun-warmed shrub. The bees were already busy among the heliotrope, and one or two gray flies with brick-colored eyes sat in a spot of sunlight beside the marble seat, or chased each other about, only to return again to the spot of sunshine and rub their forelegs, exulting. The sentries passed briskly before the painted boxes, pausing at times to look toward the guard-house for their relief. They came at last with a shuffle of feet and click of bayonets. The word was passed, the relief fell out, and away they went, crunch, crunch, across the gravel. A mellow chime floated from the clock-tower of the palace. The deep bell of St. Sulpice echoed the stroke. Hastings sat dreaming in the shadow of the god, and while he mused, somebody came and sat down beside him. At first he did not raise his head. It was only when she spoke that he sprung up. "You, at this hour?"
"I was restless. I could not sleep."
Then, in a low, happy voice,
"And you, at this hour?"
I slept, but the sun awoke me."
"I could not sleep,"
she said, and her eyes seemed for a moment touched with an indefinable shadow. Then, smiling,
"I am so glad. I seemed to know you were coming. Don't laugh. I believe in dreams."
"Did you really dream of my being here?"
"I think I was awake when I dreamed it,"
she admitted. Then for a time they were mute, acknowledging by silence the happiness of being together. And after all their silence was eloquent, for faint smiles and glances born of their thoughts, crossed and recrossed, until lips moved and words were formed, which seemed almost superfluous. What they said was not very profound. Perhaps the most valuable jewel that fell from Hastings's lips bore direct reference to breakfast.
"I have not yet had my chocolate," she confessed. "But what a material man you are!"
"Valentine," he said impulsively, I do wish that you would, just for this once, give me the whole day, just for this once."
"Oh dear," she smiled. "Not only material, but selfish."
"Not selfish, hungry," he said, looking at her.
"A cannibal, too. Oh dear."
"Will you, Valentine?"
"But my chocolate."
"Take it with me."
"But déjeuner."
"Together, at St. Cloud."
"But I can't."
"Together, all day long. Will you, Valentine?" She was silent. "Only for this once." Again that indefinable shadow fell across her eyes, and when it was gone she sighed.
"Yes, together, only for this once."
"All day?" he said, doubting his happiness.
"All day," she smiled. "And oh, I am so hungry."
He laughed, enchanted. "What a material young lady it is!" On the Boulevard St. Michel there is a creamery painted white and blue outside, and neat and clean as a whistle inside. The auburn-haired young woman who speaks French like a native, and rejoices in the name of Murphy, smiled at them as they entered, and tossing a fresh napkin over the zinc tete-a-tete table, whisked before them 2 cups of chocolate and a basketful of crisp, fresh croissants. The primrose-colored pats of butter, each shaped with a shamrock in relief, seemed saturated with the fragrance of Normandy pastures. "How delicious!" they said in the same breath, and then laughed at the coincidence. "With but a single thought," he began.
How absurd!" she cried with cheeks all rosy. "I'm thinking I'd like a croissant."
"So am I," he replied triumphant. "That proves it." Then they had a quarrel, she accusing him of behaviour unworthy of a child in arms, and he denying it, and bringing counter-charges until Mademoiselle Murphy laughed in sympathy, and the last croissant was eaten under a flag of truce. Then they rose, and she took his arm with a bright nod to Mademoiselle Murphy, who cried them a merry "Bonjour, madame, bonjour, monsieur," and watched them hail a passing cab and drive away. "Dieu, qu'il est beau!" she sighed, adding after a moment, "Do they be married? I dunno. Ma foi, ils ont bien l'air." The cab swung around the Rue de Medici, turned into the Rue de Vaugirard, followed it to where it crosses the Rue de Rennes, and taking that noisy thoroughfare, drew up before the Gare Montparnasse. They were just in time for a train, and scampered up the stairway and out to the cars as the last note from the starting gong rang through the arched station. The guard slammed the door of their compartment, a whistle sounded, answered by a screech from the locomotive, and the long train glided from the station, faster, faster, and sped out into the morning sunshine. The summer wind blew in their faces from the open window, and sent the soft hair dancing on the girl's forehead. "We have the compartment to ourselves," said Hastings. She leaned against the cushioned window-seat, her eyes bright and wide open, her lips parted. The wind lifted her hat and fluttered the ribbons under her chin. With a quick movement she untied them, and drawing a long hat-pin from her hat, laid it down on the seat beside her. The train was flying. The color surged in her cheeks, and with each quick-drawn breath her breath rose and fell under the cluster of lilies at her throat. Trees, horses, ponds danced past, cut by a mist of telegraph poles.
"Faster, faster!" she cried.
His eyes never left her, but hers, wide open and blue as the summer sky, seemed fixed on something far ahead, something which came no nearer, but fled before them as they fled. Was it the horizon, cut now by the grim fortress on the hill, now by the cross of Country Chapel? Was it the summer moon, ghost-like, slipping through the vaguer blue above?
"Faster, faster!" she cried.
Her parted lips burned scarlet. The car shook and shivered, and the fields streamed by like an emerald torrent. He caught the excitement, and his face glowed.
"Oh!" she cried,
and with an unconscious movement caught his hand, drawing him to the window beside her.
"Look! Lean out with me!"
He only saw her lips move, her voice was drowned in the roar of a trestle, but his hand closed in hers, and he clung to the sill. The wind whistled in their ears. "Not so far out, Valentine! Take care!" he gasped. Below, through the ties of the trestle, a broad river flashed into view and out again, as the train thundered along a tunnel, and away once more through the freshest of green fields. The wind roared about them. The girl was leaning far out from the window, and he caught her by the waist, crying, "Not too far!" But she only murmured,
"Faster, faster! Away out of the city, out of the land! Faster, faster! Away out of the world!"
"What are you saying all to yourself?" he said, but his voice was broken, and the wind whirled all back into his throat. She heard him, and turning from the window looked down at his arm about her. Then she raised her eyes to his. The car shook and the windows rattled. They were dashing through a forest now, and the sun swept the dewy branches with running flashes of fire. He looked into her troubled eyes. He drew her to him and kissed the half-parted lips, and she cried out a bitter, hopeless cry. Not that, not that!" But he held her close and strong, whispering words of honest love and passion, and when she sobbed, "Not that, not that! I have promised. You must know I am not worthy." In the purity of his own heart her words were to him meaningless then, meaningless forever after. Presently her voice ceased and her head rested on his breast. He leaned against the window, his ears swept by the furious wind, his heart in a joyous tumult. The forest was past, and the sun slipped from behind the trees, flooding the earth again with brightness. She raised her eyes and looked out into the world from the window. Then she began to speak, but her voice was faint, and he bent his head close to hers and listened.
"I cannot turn from you. I am too weak. You were long ago my master, master of my heart and soul. I have broken my word to one who trusted me, but I have told you all. What matters the rest?"
He smiled at her innocence, and she worshipped his. She spoke again.
"Take me or cast me away. What matters it? Now with a word you can kill me, and it might be easier to die than to look upon happiness as great as mine."
He took her in his arms. "Hush! What are you saying? Look out at the sunlight, the meadows and the streams. We shall be very happy in so bright a world." She turned to the sunlight. From the window, the world below seemed very fair to her. Trembling with happiness, she sighed.
"Is this the world? Then I have never known it."
"Nor have I. God forgive me," he murmured. Perhaps it was our gentle Lady of the Fields who forgave them both.
End of parts 5 and 6.
End of The Street of Our Lady of the Fields by Robert W. Chambers.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. Rue Barré. A poem. Rue Barré. For let philosopher and doctor preach of what they will, and what they will not. Each is but one link in an eternal chain that none can slip, nor break, nor overreach. Crimson nor yellow roses, nor the savour of the mounting sea are worth the perfume I adore that clings to thee. The languid-headed lilies tire, the changeless waters weary me. I ache with passionate desire of thine and thee. There are but these things in the world, thy mouth of fire, thy breasts, thy hands, thy hair upcurled, and my desire. Part 1. One morning at Julian's, a student said to Selby, "That is Foxhall Clifford," pointing with his brushes at a young man who sat before an easel, doing nothing. Selby, shy and nervous, walked over and began, "My name is Selby. I have just arrived in Paris, and bring a letter of introduction." His voice was lost in the crash of a falling easel, the owner of which promptly assaulted his neighbor, and for a time the noise of battle rolled through the studios of Messieurs Boulanger and Lefebvre, presently subsiding into a scuffle on the stairs outside. Selby, apprehensive as to his own reception in the studio, looked at Clifford, who sat serenely watching the fight. "It's a little noisy here," said Clifford, "but you will like the fellows when you know them." His unaffected manner delighted Selby. Then, with a simplicity that won his heart, he presented him to half a dozen students of as many nationalities. Some were cordial, all were polite. Even the majestic creature who held the position of Monsieur, unbent enough to say, "My friend, when a man speaks French as well as you do, and is also a friend of Monsieur Clifford, he will have no trouble in this studio. You expect, of course, to fill the stove until the next new man comes?" "Of course." "And you don't mind chaff?" "No," replied Selby, who hated it. Clifford, much amused, put on his hat, saying, "You must expect lots of it at first." Selby placed his own hat on his head and followed him to the door. As they passed the model stand, there was a furious cry of "Chapeau! Chapeau!" and a student sprang from his easel, menacing Selby, who reddened but looked at Clifford. "Ha, ha, ha! Take off your hat for them," said the latter, laughing. A little embarrassed, he turned and saluted the studio. "Et moi?" cried the model. "You are charming," replied Selby, astonished at his own audacity. But the studio rose as one man, shouting, "He has done well! He's all right!" while the model, laughing, kissed her hand to him and cried, "À demain, beau jeune homme!" All that week Selby worked at the studio unmolested. The French students christened him l'enfant prodigue, which was freely translated the prodigious infant, the Kid Selby, and Kidby. But the disease soon ran its course, from Kidby to kidney, and then naturally to Tidbits, where it was arrested by Clifford's authority and ultimately relapsed to Kid. Wednesday came, and with it Monsieur Boulanger. For 3 hours the students writhed under his biting sarcasms, among the others Clifford, who was informed that he knew even less about a work of art than he did about the art of work. Selby was more fortunate. The professor examined his drawing in silence, looked at him sharply, and passed on with a non-committal gesture. He presently departed arm-in-arm with Bouguereau, to the relief of Clifford, who was then at liberty to jam his hat on his head and depart. The next day he did not appear, and Selby, who had counted on seeing him at the studio, a thing which he learnt later it was vanity to count on, wandered back to the Latin Quarter alone. Paris was still strange and new to him. He was vaguely troubled by its splendor. No tender memories stirred his American bosom at the Place du Châtelet, nor even by Notre Dame, the Palais de Justice with its clock and turrets and stalking sentinels in blue and vermilion, the Place Saint-Michel with its jumble of omnibuses and ugly water-spitting griffins, the hill of the Boulevard Saint-Michel, the tooting trams, the policemen dawdling 2 by 2, and the table-lined terraces of the Café Vachette were nothing to him, as yet. Nor did he even know, when he stepped from the stones of the Place Saint-Michel to the asphalt of the boulevard, that he had crossed the frontier and entered the student zone, the famous Latin Quarter. A cabman hailed him as bourgeois, and urged the superiority of driving over walking. A gamin, with an appearance of great concern, requested the latest telegraphic news from London, and then, standing on his head, invited Selby to feats of strength. A pretty girl gave him a glance from a pair of violet eyes. He did not see her, but she, catching her own reflection in a window, wondered at the color burning in her cheeks. Turning to resume her course, she met Foxhall Clifford and hurried on. Clifford, open-mouthed, followed her with his eyes. Then he looked after Selby, who had turned into the Boulevard Saint-Germain toward the Rue de Seine. Then he examined himself in the shop window. The result seemed to be unsatisfactory. "I'm not a beauty," he mused, "but neither am I a hobgoblin. What does she mean by blushing at Selby? I never before saw her look at a fellow in my life. Neither has anyone in the quarter. Anyway, I can swear she never looks at me, and goodness knows I have done all that respectful adoration can do." He sighed, and murmuring a prophecy concerning the salvation of his immortal soul, swung into that graceful lounge which at all times characterized Clifford. With no apparent exertion, he overtook Selby at the corner, and together they crossed the sunlit boulevard and sat down under the awning of the Café du Cercle. Clifford bowed to everybody on the terrace, saying, "You shall meet them all later, but now let me present you to 2 of the sights of Paris, Mr. Richard Elliot and Mr. Stanley Rowden." The sights looked amiable, and took vermouth. "You cut the studio today," said Elliot, suddenly turning on Clifford, who avoided his eyes. "To commune with nature?" observed Rowden. "What's her name this time?" asked Elliot, and Rowden answered promptly. "Name, Yvette. Nationality, Breton." "Wrong," replied Clifford blandly. "It's Rue Barrée." The subject changed instantly, and Selby listened in surprise to names which were new to him, and eulogies on the latest Prix de Rome winner. He was delighted to hear opinions boldly expressed and points honestly debated. Although the vehicle was mostly slang, both English and French, he longed for the time when he too should be plunged into the strife for fame. The bells of Saint-Sulpice struck the hour, and the Palace of the Luxembourg answered chime on chime. With a glance at the sun, dipping low in the golden dust behind the Palais Bourbon, they rose, and turning to the east, crossed the Boulevard Saint-Germain and sauntered toward the École de Médecine. At the corner a girl passed them, walking hurriedly. Clifford smirked. Elliot and Rowden were agitated, but they all bowed, and, without raising her eyes, she returned their salute. But Selby, who had lagged behind, fascinated by some gay shop window, looked up to meet two of the bluest eyes he had ever seen. The eyes were dropped in an instant, and the young fellow hastened to overtake the others. "By Jove," he said, "do you fellows know I have just seen the prettiest girl?" An exclamation broke from the trio, gloomy, foreboding, like the chorus in a Greek play. "Rue Barrée!" "What?" cried Selby, bewildered. The only answer was a vague gesture from Clifford. 2 hours later, during dinner, Clifford turned to Selby and said, "You want to ask me something. I can tell by the way you fidget about." "Yes, I do," he said innocently enough. "It's about that girl. Who is she?" In Rowden's smile there was pity, in Elliot's bitterness. "Her name," said Clifford solemnly, "is unknown to anyone, at least," he added with much conscientiousness, "as far as I can learn. Every fellow in the Latin Quarter bows to her, and she returns the salute gravely, but no man has ever been known to obtain more than that. Her profession, judging from her music roll, is that of a pianist. Her residence is in a small and humble street which is kept in a perpetual process of repair by the city authorities. And from the black letters painted on the barrier which defends the street from traffic, she has taken the name by which we know her, Rue Barrée. Mr. Rowden, in his imperfect knowledge of the French tongue, called our attention to it as Rue Barry." "I didn't!" said Rowden hotly. "And Rue Barry, or Rue Barrée, is today an object of adoration to every rapin in the quarter." "We are not rapins," corrected Elliot. "I am not," returned Clifford. "And I beg to call to your attention, Selby, that these two gentlemen have at various and apparently unfortunate moments offered to lay down life and limb at the feet of Rue Barrée. The lady possesses a chilling smile which she uses on such occasions, and—" here he became gloomily impressive, "I have been forced to believe that neither the scholarly grace of my friend Elliot nor the buxom beauty of my friend Rowden have touched that heart of ice." Elliot and Rowden, boiling with indignation, cried out, "And you?" "I," said Clifford blandly, "do fear to tread where you rush in." Part 2. 24 hours later Selby had completely forgotten Rue Barrée. During the week he worked with might and main at the studio, and Saturday night found him so tired that he went to bed before dinner and had a nightmare about a river of yellow ochre in which he was drowning. Sunday morning, apropos of nothing at all, he thought of Rue Barrée, and 10 seconds afterwards he saw her. It was at the flower market on the Marble Bridge. She was examining a pot of pansies. The gardener had evidently thrown heart and soul into the transaction, but Rue Barrée shook her head. It is a question whether Selby would have stopped then and there to inspect a cabbage rose had not Clifford unwound for him the yarn of the previous Tuesday. It is possible that his curiosity was piqued, for with the exception of a hen turkey, a boy of 19 is the most openly curious biped alive. From 20 until death he tries to conceal it, but, to be fair to Selby, it is also true that the market was attractive. Under a cloudless sky the flowers were packed and heaped along the marble bridge to the parapet. The air was soft. The sun spun a shadowy lacework among the palms and glowed in the hearts of 1,000 roses. Spring had come, was in full tide. The watering carts and sprinklers spread freshness over the boulevard. The sparrows had become vulgarly obtrusive, and the credulous Seine angler anxiously followed his gaudy quill floating among the soapsuds of the lavoirs. The white-spiked chestnuts clad in tender green vibrated with the hum of bees. Shoddy butterflies flaunted their winter rags among the heliotrope. There was a smile of fresh earth in the air, an echo of the woodland brook in the ripple of the Seine, and swallows soared and skimmed along the anchored river craft. Somewhere in a window a caged bird was singing its heart out to the sky. Selby looked at the cabbage rows and then at the sky. Something in the song of the caged bird may have moved him, or perhaps it was that dangerous sweetness in the air of May. At first he was hardly conscious that he had stopped, then he was scarcely conscious why he had stopped. Then he thought he would move on, then he thought he wouldn't. Then he looked at Rue Barré. The gardener said, "Mademoiselle, this is undoubtedly a fine pot of pansies." Rue Barré shook her head. The gardener smiled. She evidently did not want the pansies. She had bought many pots of pansies there, 2 or 3 every spring, and never argued. What did she want, then? The pansies were evidently a feeler toward a more important transaction. The gardener rubbed his hands and gazed about him. "These tulips are magnificent," he observed, "and these hyacinths." He fell into a trance at the mere sight of the scented thickets. "That," murmured Rue, pointing to a splendid rose-bush with her furled parasol. But in spite of her, her voice trembled a little. Selby noticed it, more shame to him that he was listening, and the gardener noticed it, and, burying his nose in the roses, scented a bargain. Still, to do him justice, he did not add a centime to the honest value of the plant, for, after all, Rue was probably poor, and anyone could see she was charming. 50 francs, mademoiselle. The gardener's tone was grave. Rue felt that argument would be wasted. They both stood silent for a moment. The gardener did not eulogize his prize. The rose tree was gorgeous, and anyone could see it. "I will take the pansies," said the girl, and drew 2 francs from a worn purse. Then she looked up. A teardrop stood in the way, refracting the light like a diamond, but as it rolled into a little corner by her nose, a vision of Selby replaced it, and when a brush of the handkerchief had cleared the startled blue eyes, Selby himself appeared, very much embarrassed. He instantly looked up into the sky, apparently devoured with a thirst for astronomical research, and as he continued his investigations for fully 5 minutes, the gardener looked up too, and so did a policeman. Then Selby looked at the tips of his boots. The gardener looked at him, and the policeman slouched on. Rue Barré had been gone some time. "What?" said the gardener. "May I offer monsieur?" Selby never knew why, but he suddenly began to buy flowers. The gardener was electrified. Never before had he sold so many flowers, never at such satisfying prices, and never with such absolute unanimity of opinion with a customer. But he missed the bargaining, the arguing, the calling of heaven to witness. The transaction lacked a spice. "These tulips are magnificent." "They are," cried Selby warmly.
"But alas, they are dear."
"I will take them." "Dieu!" murmured the gardener in a perspiration.
"He is madder than most Englishmen."
"This cactus is gorgeous."
"Alas."
"Send it with the rest." The gardener braced himself against the river wall.
"That splendid rose bush," he began faintly.
"That is a beauty. I believe it is 50 francs.
He stopped, very red. The gardener relished his confusion. Then a sudden cool self-possession took the place of his momentary confusion, and he held the gardener with his eye, and bullied him.
"I'll take that bush. Why did not the young lady buy it?"
"Mademoiselle is not wealthy."
"How do you know?"
"Dame, I sell her many pansies. Pansies are not expensive."
"Those are the pansies she bought?"
"These, monsieur, the blue and gold."
"Then you intend to send them to her?"
"At midday after the market."
"Take this rosebush with them, and—" Here he glared at the gardener. "Don't you dare say from whom they came." The gardener's eyes were like saucers, but Selby, calm and victorious, said, "Send the others to the Hôtel du Sénat, 7 Rue de Tournon. I will leave directions with the concierge." Then he buttoned his glove with much dignity and stalked off. But when well round the corner and hidden from the gardener's view, the conviction that he was an idiot came home to him in a furious blush. 10 minutes later he sat in his room in the Hôtel du Sénat, repeating with an imbecile smile, "What an ass I am! What an ass!" An hour later found him in the same chair, in the same position, his hat and gloves still on, his stick in his hand, but he was silent, apparently lost in contemplation of his boot-toes, and his smile was less imbecile and even a bit retrospective. Part 3. About 5 o'clock that afternoon, the little sad-eyed woman who fills the position of concierge at the Hôtel du Sénat held up her hands in amazement to see a wagon-load of flower-bearing shrubs draw up before the doorway. She called Joseph, the intemperate garçon, who, while calculating the value of the flowers in petits verres, gloomily disclaimed any knowledge as to their destination. "Voyons," said the little concierge, "cherchons la femme." "You?" he suggested. The little woman stood a moment pensive and then sighed. Joseph caressed his nose, a nose which for gaudiness could vie with any floral display. Then the gardener came in, hat in hand, and a few minutes later Selby stood in the middle of his room, his coat off, his shirt-sleeves rolled up. The chamber originally contained, besides the furniture, about 2 square feet of walking room, and now this was occupied by a cactus. The bed groaned under crates of pansies, lilies, and heliotrope. The lounge was covered with hyacinths and tulips, and the washstand supported a species of young tree warranted to bear flowers at some time or other. Clifford came in a little later, fell over a box of sweet peas, swore a little, apologized, and then, as the full splendor of the floral fête burst upon him, sat down in astonishment upon a geranium. The geranium was a wreck, but Selby said, "Don't mind," and glared at the cactus. "Are you going to give a ball?" demanded Clifford. "No, I'm very fond of flowers," said Selby, but the statement lacked enthusiasm. "I should imagine so." Then, after a silence, "That's a fine cactus." Selby contemplated the cactus, touched it with the air of a connoisseur, and pricked his thumb. Clifford poked a pansy with his stick. Then Joseph came in with the bill, announcing the sum total in a loud voice, partly to impress Clifford, partly to intimidate Selby into disgorging a pourboire, which he would share, if he chose, with the gardener. Clifford tried to pretend that he had not heard, while Selby paid bill and tribute without a murmur. Then he lounged back into the room with an attempt at indifference which failed entirely when he tore his trousers on the cactus. Clifford made some commonplace remark, lighted a cigarette, and looked out of the window to give Selby a chance. Selby tried to take it, but getting as far as, "Yes, spring is here at last," froze solid. He looked at the back of Clifford's head. It expressed volumes. Those little perked-up ears seemed tingling with suppressed glee. He made a desperate effort to master the situation, and jumped up to reach for some Russian cigarettes as an incentive to conversation, but was foiled by the cactus, to whom again he fell a prey. The last straw was added. "Damn the cactus!" This observation was wrung from Selby against his will, against his own instinct of self-preservation. But the thorns on the cactus were long and sharp, and at their repeated prick his pent-up wrath escaped. It was too late now. It was done, and Clifford had wheeled around. "See here, Selby, why the deuce did you buy those flowers?" "I'm fond of them," said Selby. "What are you going to do with them? You can't sleep here." "I could, if you'd help me take the pansies off the bed." "Where can you put them?" "Couldn't I give them to the concierge?" As soon as he said it, he regretted it. What in heaven's name would Clifford think of him? He had heard the amount of the bill. Would he believe that he had invested in these luxuries as a timid declaration to his concierge? And would the Latin Quarter comment upon it in their own brutal fashion? He dreaded ridicule, and he knew Clifford's reputation. Then somebody knocked. Selby looked at Clifford with a hunted expression which touched that young man's heart. It was a confession, and at the same time a supplication. Clifford jumped up, threaded his way through the floral labyrinth, and putting an eye to the crack of the door, said, "Who the devil is it?" This graceful style of reception is indigenous to the quarter. "It's Elliot," he said, looking back, "and Rowden, too, and their bulldogs." Then he addressed them through the crack. "Sit down on the stairs. Selby and I are coming out directly." Discretion is a virtue. The Latin Quarter possesses few, and discretion seldom figures on the list. They sat down and began to whistle. Presently Rowden called out, "I smell flowers. They feast within." "You ought to know Selby better than that," growled Clifford behind the door, while the other hurriedly exchanged his torn trousers for others. "We know Selby," said Elliot with emphasis. "Yes," said Rowden. "He gives receptions with floral decorations and invites Clifford while we sit on the stairs." "Yes, while the youth and beauty of the quarter revel," suggested Rowden. Then, with sudden misgiving, "Is Odette there?" "See here," demanded Elliot. "Is Colette there?" Then he raised his voice in a plaintive howl. "Are you there, Colette, while I'm kicking my heels on these tiles?" "Clifford is capable of anything," said Rowden. "His nature is soured since Rue Barrée sat on him." Elliot raised his voice. "I say, you fellows, we saw some flowers carried into Rue Barrée's house at noon." "Posies and roses," specified Rowden. "Probably for her," added Elliot, caressing his bulldog. Clifford turned with sudden suspicion upon Selby. The latter hummed a tune, selected a pair of gloves, and choosing a dozen cigarettes, placed them in a case. Then, walking over to the cactus, he deliberately detached a blossom, drew it through his buttonhole, and picking up hat and stick, smiled upon Clifford, at which the latter was mightily troubled. Part 4. Monday morning at Julian's, students fought for places. Students with prior claims drove away others who had been anxiously squatting on coveted tabourets since the door was opened, in hopes of appropriating them at roll call. Students squabbled over palettes, brushes, portfolios, or rent the air with demands for Cicerone bread. The former, a dirty ex-model, who had in palmier days posed as Judas, now dispensed stale bread at 1 sou and made enough to keep himself in cigarettes. Monsieur Julien walked in, smiled a fatherly smile, and walked out. His disappearance was followed by the apparition of the clerk, a foxy creature who flitted through the battling hordes in search of prey. 3 men who had not paid dues were caught and summoned. A 4th was scented, followed, outflanked, his retreat towards the door cut off, and finally captured behind the stove. About that time, the revolution assuming an acute form, howls rose for "Jules!" Jules came, umpired 2 fights with a sad resignation in his brown eyes, shook hands with everybody, and melted away in the throng, leaving an atmosphere of peace and goodwill. The lions sat down with the lambs, the massiers marked the best places for themselves and friends, and mounting the model stands, opened the roll calls. The word was passed. "They begin with C this week." They did. "Clisson!" Clisson jumped like a flash and marked his name on the floor in chalk before a front seat. "Caron!" Caron galloped away to secure his place. Bang went an easel. "Nom de Dieu!" in French. "Where in the hell are you going?" in English. Crash! A paint-box fell with brushes and all on board. "Dieu! Dieu de!" spat. A blow, a short rush, a clinch and scuffle, and the voice of the massier, stern and reproachful. "Cochon!" Then the roll call was resumed. "Clifford!" The massier paused and looked up, one finger between the leaves of the ledger. "Clifford!" Clifford was not there. He was about 3 miles away, in a direct line, and every instant increased the distance. Not that he was walking fast. On the contrary, he was strolling with that leisurely gait peculiar to himself. Elliot was beside him, and 2 bulldogs covered the rear. Elliot was reading the Gil Blas, from which he seemed to extract amusement, but deeming boisterous mirth unsuitable to Clifford's state of mind, subdued his amusement to a series of discreet smiles. The latter, moodily aware of this, said nothing, but leading the way into the Luxembourg Gardens, installed himself upon a bench by the northern terrace and surveyed the landscape with disfavour. Elliot, according to the Luxembourg regulations, tied the two dogs, and then, with an interrogative glance towards his friend, resumed the Gil Blas and the discreet smiles. The day was perfect. The sun hung over Notre Dame, setting the city in a glitter. The tender foliage of the chestnuts cast a shadow over the terrace and flecked the paths and walks with traceries so blue that Clifford might here have found encouragement for his violent impressions had he but looked. But as usual in this period of his career, his thoughts were anywhere except in his profession. Around about, the sparrows quarrelled and chattered their courtship songs. The big rosy pigeons sailed from tree to tree. The flies whirled in the sunbeams, and the flowers exhaled 1,000 perfumes which stirred Clifford with languorous wistfulness. Under this influence he spoke. "Elliot, you are a true friend." "You make me ill," replied the latter, folding his paper. "It's just as I thought. You're tagging after some new petticoat again. And," he continued wrathfully, "if this is what you've kept me away from Julian's for, if it's to fill me up with the perfections of some little idiot—" "Not idiot," remonstrated Clifford gently. "See here," cried Elliot. "Have you the nerve to try to tell me that you are in love again?" "Again?" "Yes, again, and again, and again, and— By George, have you?" "This," observed Clifford sadly, "is serious." For a moment Elliot would have laid hands on him. Then he laughed from sheer helplessness. Oh, go on, let's see. There's Clemence and Marie Telec and Cosette and Fifine, Colette, Marie Verdier, all of whom are charming, most charming, but I never was serious." "So help me Moses," said Elliot solemnly. "Each and every one of those named have separately and in turn torn your heart with anguish, and have also made me lose my place at Julian's in this same manner. Each and every one, separately and in turn. Do you deny it?" "What you say may be founded on facts, in a way, but give me the credit of being faithful to one at a time." "Until the next came along. But this is really very different, Elliot. Believe me, I am all broken up." Then, there being nothing else to do, Elliot gnashed his teeth and listened. It's Rue Barré." "Well," observed Elliot with scorn, "if you're moping and moaning over that girl, the girl who has given you and myself every reason to wish that the ground would open and engulf us, well, go on." "I'm going on. I don't care. Timidity has fled." "Yes, your native timidity." "I'm desperate, Elliot. Am I in love? Never, never did I feel so damn miserable. I can't sleep, honestly. I'm incapable of eating properly." "Same symptoms noticed in the case of Colette." "Listen, will you?" "Hold on a moment. I know the rest by heart. Now let me ask you something. Is it your belief that Rue Barré is a pure girl?" "Yes," said Clifford, turning red. "Do you love her? Not as you dangle and tiptoe after every pretty inanity. I mean, do you honestly love her?" "Yes," said the other doggedly. "I would—" "Hold on a moment. Would you marry her?" Clifford turned scarlet. "Yes," he muttered. "Pleasant news for your family," growled Elliot in suppressed fury. "Dear father, I have just married a charming grisette whom I'm sure you'll welcome with open arms, in company with her mother, a most estimable and cleanly washed lady. Good heavens! This seems to have gone a little further than the rest. Thank your stars, young man, that my head is level enough for us both. Still, in this case, I have no fear. Rue Barré sat on your aspirations in a manner unmistakably final." "Rue Barré," began Clifford, drawing himself up, but he suddenly ceased, for there where the dappled sunlight glowed in spots of gold, along the sun-flecked path, tripped Rue Barré. Her gown was spotless, and her big straw hat, tipped a little from the white forehead, threw a shadow across her eyes. Elliot stood up and bowed. Clifford removed his head covering with an air so plaintive, so appealing, so utterly humble, that Rue Barré smiled. The smile was delicious, and when Clifford, incapable of sustaining himself on his legs from sheer astonishment, toppled slightly, she smiled again in spite of herself. A few moments later she took a chair on the terrace, and drawing a book from her music roll, turned the pages, found the place, and then placing it open downwards in her lap, sighed a little, smiled a little, and looked out over the city. She had entirely forgotten Foxhall Clifford. After a while she took up her book again, but instead of reading began to adjust a rose in her corsage. The rose was big and red. It glowed like fire there over her heart, and like fire it warmed her heart, now fluttering under the silken petals. Rue Barré sighed again. She was very happy. The sky was so blue, the air so soft and perfumed, the sunshine so caressing, and her heart sang within her, sang to the rose in her breast. This is what it sang. Out of the throng of passers-by, out of the world of yesterday, out of the millions passing, one has turned aside to me. So her heart sang under his rose on her breast. Then 2 big mouse-colored pigeons came whistling by and alighted on the terrace, where they bowed and strutted and bobbed and turned until Rue Barré laughed in delight, and looking up beheld Clifford before her. His hat was in his hand, and his face was wreathed in a series of appealing smiles which would have touched the heart of a Bengal tiger. For an instant Rue Barré frowned. Then she looked curiously at Clifford. Then, when she saw the resemblance between his bows and the bobbing pigeons, in spite of herself, her lips parted in the most bewitching laugh. Was this Rue Barré? So changed that she did not know herself. But oh, that song in her heart which drowned all else, which trembled on her lips, struggling for utterance, which rippled forth in a laugh at nothing, at a strutting pigeon, and Mr. Clifford. And you think, because I return the salute of the students in the quarter, that you may be received in particular as a friend. I do not know you, monsieur, but Vanity is man's other name. Be content, Monsieur Vanity. I shall be punctilious. Oh, most punctilious in returning your salute. But I beg, I implore you to let me render you that homage which has so long... Oh dear, I don't care for homage. Let me only be permitted to speak to you now and then, occasionally, very occasionally. And if you, why not another? Not at all. I will be discretion itself. Discretion? Why? Her eyes were very clear, and Clifford winced for a moment, but only for a moment. Then the devil of recklessness seizing him, he sat down and offered himself, soul and body, goods and chattels, and all the time he knew he was a fool, and that infatuation is not love, and that each word he uttered bound him in honor from which there was no escape. And all the time Elliot was scowling down on the Fountain Plaza and savagely checking both bulldogs from their desire to rush to Clifford's rescue, for even they felt there was something wrong, as Elliot stormed within himself and growled maledictions. When Clifford finished, he finished in a glow of excitement, but Rue Barré's response was long in coming, and his ardor cooled while the situation slowly assumed its just proportions. Then regret began to creep in, but he put that aside and broke out again in protestations. At the first word Rue Barré checked him. "I thank you," she said, speaking very gravely. "No man has ever before offered me mariage." She turned and looked out over the city. After a while she spoke again. "You offer me a great deal. I am alone. I have nothing. I am nothing." She turned again and looked at Paris, brilliant, fair, in the sunshine of a perfect day. He followed her eyes. "Oh," she murmured, "it is hard, hard to work always, always alone, with never a friend you can have in honor. And the love that is offered means the streets, the boulevard, when passion is dead. I know it. We know it. We others who have nothing, have no one, and who give ourselves unquestioning when we love. Yes, unquestioning, heart and soul, knowing the end. She touched the rose at her breast. For a moment she seemed to forget him. Then quietly, I thank you. I am very grateful. She opened the book, and plucking a petal from the rose, dropped it between the leaves. Then looking up, she said gently, I cannot accept. Part 5. It took Clifford a month to entirely recover, although at the end of the first week he was pronounced convalescent by Elliot, who was an authority, and his convalescence was aided by the cordiality with which Rue Barré acknowledged his solemn salutes. 40 times a day he blessed Rue Barré for her refusal, and thanked his lucky stars, and at the same time, O wondrous heart of ours, he suffered the tortures of the blighted. Elliot was annoyed, partly by Clifford's reticence, partly by the unexplainable thaw in the frigidity of Rue Barré. At their frequent encounters, when she, tripping along the Rue de Seine, with music roll and big straw hat, would pass Clifford and his familiars, steering an easterly course to the Café Vachette, and at the respectful uncovering of the band would color and smile at Clifford, Elliot's slumbering suspicions awoke. But he never found out anything, and finally gave it up as beyond his comprehension, merely qualifying Clifford as an idiot and reserving his opinion of Rue Barré. And all this time Selby was jealous. At first he refused to acknowledge it to himself, and cut the studio for a day in the country, but the woods and fields of course aggravated his case, and the brooks babbled of Rue Barré, and the mowers calling to each other across the meadow ended in a quavering Rue Barré. That day spent in the country made him angry for a week, and he worked sulkily at Julian's, all the time tormented by a desire to know where Clifford was and what he might be doing. This culminated in an erratic stroll on Sunday, which ended at the flower market on the Pont au Change, began again, was gloomily extended to the Morgue, and again ended at the Marble Bridge. It would never do, and Selby felt it, so he went to see Clifford, who was convalescing on mint juleps in his garden. They sat down together and discussed morals and human happiness, and each found the other most entertaining, only Selby failed to pump Clifford, to the other's unfeigned amusement. But the juleps spread balm on the sting of jealousy, and trickled hope to the blighted, and when Selby said he must go, Clifford went too, and when Selby, not to be outdone, insisted on accompanying Clifford back to his door, Clifford determined to see Selby back halfway, and then finding it hard to part, they decided to dine together and flit. To flit, a verb applied to Clifford's nocturnal prowls, expressed, perhaps, as well as anything, the gaiety proposed. Dinner was ordered at Mignon's, and while Selby interviewed the chef, Clifford kept a fatherly eye on the butler. The dinner was a success, or was of the sort generally termed a success. Toward the dessert Selby heard someone say, as at a great distance, "Kid Selby, drunk as a lord." A group of men passed near them. It seemed to him that he shook hands and laughed a great deal, and that everybody was very witty. There was Clifford, opposite, swearing undying confidence in his chum Selby, and there seemed to be others there, either seated beside them or continually passing with the swish of skirts on the polished floor. The perfume of roses, the rustle of fans, the touch of rounded arms, and the laughter grew vaguer and vaguer. The room seemed enveloped in mist. Then, all in a moment, each object stood out painfully distinct. Only forms and visages were distorted and voices piercing. He drew himself up, calm, grave, for the moment master of himself, but very drunk. He knew he was drunk, and was as guarded and alert, as keenly suspicious of himself as he would have been of a thief at his elbow. His self-command enabled Clifford to hold his head safely under some running water, and repair to the street considerably the worse for wear. but never suspecting that his companion was drunk. For a time he kept his self-command. His face was only a bit paler, a bit tighter than usual. He was only a trifle slower and more fastidious in his speech. It was midnight when he left Clifford peacefully slumbering in somebody's armchair, with a long suede glove dangling in his hand and a plumy boa twisted about his neck to protect his throat from draughts. He walked through the hall and down the stairs, and found himself on the sidewalk in a quarter he did not know. Mechanically he looked up at the name of the street. The name was not familiar. He turned and steered his course towards some lights clustered at the end of the street. They proved farther away than he had anticipated, and after a long quest he came to the conclusion that his eyes had been mysteriously removed from their proper places, and had been reset on either side of his head like those of a bird. It grieved him to think of the inconvenience this transformation might occasion him, and he attempted to cock up his head, hen-like, to test the mobility of his neck. Then an immense despair stole over him. Tears gathered in the tear ducts. His heart melted, and he collided with a tree. This shocked him into comprehension. He stifled the violent tenderness in his breast, picked up his hat, and moved on more briskly. His mouth was white and drawn, his teeth tightly clenched. He held his course pretty well, and strayed but little, and after an apparently interminable length of time found himself passing a line of cabs. The brilliant lamps, red, yellow, and green, annoyed him, and he felt it might be pleasant to demolish them with his cane, but mastering this impulse, he passed on. Later an idea struck him that it would save fatigue to take a cab, and he started back with that intention, but the cabs seemed already so far away and the lanterns were so bright and confusing that he gave it up, and pulling himself together, looked around. A shadow, a mass, huge, undefined, rose to his right. He recognized the Arc de Triomphe and gravely shook his cane at it. Its size annoyed him. He felt it was too big. Then he heard something fall clattering to the pavement, and thought probably it was his cane, but it didn't matter much. When he had mastered himself and regained control of his right leg, which betrayed symptoms of insubordination, he found himself traversing the Place de la Concorde at a pace which threatened to land him at the Madeleine. This would never do. He turned sharply to the right, and crossing the bridge, passed the Palais Bourbon at a trot and wheeled into the Boulevard Saint-Germain. He got on well enough, although the size of the War Office struck him as a personal insult, and he missed his cane, which it would have been pleasant to drag along the iron railings as he passed. It occurred to him, however, to substitute his hat, but when he found it he forgot what he wanted it for and replaced it upon his head with gravity. Then he was obliged to battle with a violent inclination to sit down and weep. This lasted until he came to the Rue de Rennes, but there he became absorbed in contemplating the dragon on the balcony overhanging the Cour de Dragon, and time slipped away until he remembered vaguely that he had no business there, and marched off again. It was slow work. The inclination to sit down and weep had given place to a desire for solitary and deep reflection. Here his right leg forgot its obedience, and attacking the left, outflanked it and brought him up against a wooden board which seemed to bar his path. He tried to walk around it, but found the street closed. He tried to push it over, and found he couldn't. Then he noticed a red lantern standing on a pile of paving stones inside the barrier. This was pleasant. How was he to get home if the boulevard was blocked? But he was not on the boulevard. His treacherous right leg had beguiled him into a detour, for there, behind him, lay the boulevard with its endless line of lamps, and here, what was this narrow, dilapidated street piled up with earth and mortar and heaps of stone? He looked up. Written in staring black letters on the barrier was Rue Barré. He sat down. 2 policemen whom he knew came by and advised him to get up, but he argued the question from a standpoint of personal taste, and they passed on, laughing, for he was at the moment absorbed in a problem. It was how to see Rue Barré. She was somewhere or other in that big house with the iron balconies, and the door was locked. But what of that? The simple idea struck him to shout until she came. This idea was replaced by another equally lucid, to hammer on the door until she came. But finally rejecting both of these as too uncertain, he decided to climb into the balcony, and opening a window politely, inquire for Rue Barrée. There was but one lighted window in the house that he could see. It was on the second floor, and toward this he cast his eyes. Then, mounting the wooden barrier and clambering over the piles of stones, he reached the sidewalk and looked up at the façade for a foothold. It seemed impossible, but a sudden fury seized him, a blind, drunken obstinacy, and the blood rushed to his head, leaping, beating in his ears like the dull thunder of an ocean. He set his teeth, and springing at a window-sill, dragged himself up and hung to the iron bars. Then reason fled. There surged in his brain the sound of many voices. His heart leapt up beating in mad tattoo, and gripping at cornice and ledge he worked his way along the façade, clung to pipes and shutters, and dragged himself up, over and into the balcony by the lighted window. His hat fell off and rolled against the pane. For a moment he leaned breathless against the railing. Then the window was slowly opened from within. They stared at each other for some time. Presently the girl took 2 unsteady steps back into the room. He saw her face, all crimsoned now. He saw her sink into a chair by the lamplit table, and without a word he followed her into the room, closing the big door-like panes behind him. Then they looked at each other in silence. The room was small and white. Everything was white about it. The curtained bed, the little washstand in the corner, the bare walls, the china lamp, and his own face, had he known it, but the face and neck of Rue were surging in the color that dyed the blossoming rose-tree there on the hearth beside her. It did not occur to him to speak. She seemed not to expect it. His mind was struggling with the impressions of the room. The whiteness, the extreme purity of everything occupied him, began to trouble him. As his eye became accustomed to the light, other objects grew from the surroundings and took their places in the circle of lamplight. There was a piano and a coal scuttle and a little iron trunk and a bathtub. Then there was a row of wooden pegs against the door, with a white chintz curtain covering the clothes underneath. On the bed lay an umbrella and a big straw hat, and on the table a music roll unfurled, an inkstand, and sheets of ruled paper. Behind him stood a wardrobe faced with a mirror, but somehow he did not care to see his own face just then. He was sobering. The girl sat looking at him without a word. Her face was expressionless, yet the lips at times trembled almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, so wonderfully blue in the daylight, seemed dark and soft as velvet, and the color on her neck deepened and whitened with every breath. She seemed smaller and more slender than when he had seen her in the street, and there was now something in the curve of her cheek almost infantine. When at last he turned and caught his own reflection in the mirror behind him, a shock passed through him as though he had seen a shameful thing, and his clouded mind and his clouded thoughts grew clearer. For a moment their eyes met, then his sought the floor. His lips tightened, and the struggle within him bowed his head and strained every nerve to the breaking. And now it was over, for the voice within had spoken. He listened, dully interested, but already knowing the end. Indeed, it little mattered. The end would always be the same for him. He understood now, always the same for him, and he listened, dully interested, to a voice which grew within him. After a while he stood up, and she rose at once, one small hand resting on the table. Presently he opened the window, picked up his hat, and shut it again. Then he went over to the rose-bush and touched the blossoms with his face. One was standing in a glass of water on the table, and mechanically the girl drew it out, pressed it with her lips, and laid it on the table beside him. He took it without a word, and crossing the room, opened the door. The landing was dark and silent, but the girl lifted the lamp and, gliding past him, slipped down the polished stairs to the hallway. Then, unchaining the bolts, she drew open the iron wicket. Through this he passed with his rose. End of Rue Barré. From The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. Read by Sandra in South Wales, United Kingdom. July 2006.
Thanks for visiting Timeless Audiobooks. Please remember to like, comment, share and subscribe for our latest audiobook uploads.